While my mother fought for every single breath on an ICU ventilator, my father brought his 26-year-old lover into our family home and told me to get used to his new life. I almost swallowed my pride and stayed completely silent just to protect my mother. That was until a lawyer rang the doorbell carrying a stack of papers that my father never saw coming. My name is Nathaniel Hayes, and I am going to tell you how the darkest night of my life turned into the ultimate lesson in systemic karma. The rhythmic and mechanical hiss of the hospital ventilator was still echoing deeply in my skull when I pulled my car into the driveway of my childhood home. It was just past midnight. The air outside was freezing, a bitter winter wind biting at my face the second I stepped out of my vehicle. For the last 72 hours, I had been sitting in a hard, unforgiving plastic chair in the intensive care unit at the city hospital. I had been watching my mother Helen fight a brutally unfair and losing battle against a massive stroke. Her chest only rose because a machine forced the air directly into her lungs. I was 38 years old, a grown man who analyzed complex commercial supply chains for a living, but walking up those familiar brick front steps in the dead of night, I felt like a terrified, helpless kid. I had only come back to the house for a brief moment to grab a clean change of clothes, take a quick shower, and maybe catch 2 miserable hours of sleep before heading straight back to her bedside. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped quietly into the grand foyer. The house should have been dead silent. It should have felt like a quiet tomb reflecting the massive tragedy that was currently hanging over our family. Instead, as I took off my coat, I heard the distinct clink of crystal glasses and the soft, upbeat sound of jazz music drifting from the main living room. I walked down the long hallway, my heavy boots making dull thuds on the polished hardwood floor. When I turned the corner, the bone-deep exhaustion vanished from my body in a fraction of a second. It was instantly replaced by a blinding, sickening surge of adrenaline. My father, Richard Hayes, a man who had built a massive and ruthless regional commercial real estate empire, was standing casually by the large stone fireplace. He was wearing a comfortable cashmere sweater, looking completely relaxed, pouring 2 full glasses of very expensive single malt scotch. Sitting on my mother's custom-upholstered sofa, the one she had spent months picking out, was a young blonde woman. She could not have been more than 26 years old. She had a brightly colored designer handbag resting carelessly on the antique coffee table next to her feet. Worse than that, a massive hard-shell travel suitcase was parked right in the middle of my mother's expensive Persian living room rug. I stood completely frozen in the doorway. My brain violently struggled to process the sheer audacity and disrespect of what I was looking at. Richard turned around, handed the young girl her glass of scotch, and finally noticed me standing there in the shadows of the hall. He did not flinch. He did not look guilty. He did not even look surprised. He just took a slow, arrogant sip of his drink. "Nate, you are home early," my father said. His voice was as smooth and unbothered as if we were casually discussing the local weather forecast. "I thought you were staying at the hospital all night to monitor the machines." I stared at the strange woman, then down at her large suitcase, and then directly back at the man who had been married to my mother for over 40 years. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked, my voice trembling with a violent rage I could barely contain. "Who is this person, and why is her luggage sitting in the middle of my mother's living room?" The young woman looked away immediately, taking a quick sip of her drink and acting as if my physical presence in the room was nothing more than a mild temporary inconvenience to her evening. Richard sighed deeply, setting his crystal glass down on the mantel with a heavy thud that echoed in the large room. "This is Tiffany," my father said, waving his hand carelessly toward her. "And since the doctors have made it perfectly clear to me this afternoon that Helen is completely brain dead and is never waking up, Tiffany is moving into the master bedroom tonight. It is time we all accept the harsh reality of the situation and move on with our lives." The words hit me like a solid physical blow directly to the chest. My mother was not dead. She was lying in a sterile hospital bed exactly 3 miles away, connected to dozens of tubes and wires fighting desperately for a medical miracle. And my father, the man who had sworn before God to protect her and love her in sickness and in health, had not only written her off as an expired and depreciated asset, but he had actually brought his young mistress into her sacred home before her heart had even stopped beating. "Are you completely out of your mind?" I shouted, stepping fully into the brightly lit room, my fists clenched at my sides. "My mother is still alive. She is breathing right now as we speak. You belong at the hospital sitting by her side, not standing in her house pouring expensive drinks for a child." Tiffany scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes and sinking even deeper into my mother's sofa cushions. "Richard, please deal with him," she muttered, sounding incredibly bored and annoyed. That specific tone did it. The very last thread of my emotional self-control snapped completely. I lunged forward across the room, grabbed the heavy plastic handle of Tiffany's suitcase, and began dragging it violently toward the front hallway. "Get out of this house right now!" I roared my voice, literally shaking the picture frames on the walls. "Get your things and get out of my mother's house, or I swear to you I will physically throw both of you out onto the freezing street myself." I fully expected my father to yell back at me. I expected him to step up and try to physically stop me from throwing the luggage out. But Richard Hayes did not build a multi-million-dollar real estate empire by losing his temper and shouting. He built his wealth by finding other people's emotional pressure points and crushing them without mercy. "Put the bag down, Nathaniel," my father said calmly. His voice was not loud, but it was laced with a chilling, absolute authority that stopped me in my tracks. I stopped dragging the heavy suitcase, my chest heaving up and down as I glared back at him with pure hatred. "Make me do it," I challenged him. Richard walked slowly toward me, stopping just a few feet away so I could see the coldness in his eyes. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity and disgust. "You have always been so highly emotional, Nate. So weak and irrational. You act exactly like your mother. But let me remind you of how the real world actually works. I am your mother's legal husband. I hold the complete medical power of attorney. I control every single financial account, every health insurance policy, and every single dollar that is currently paying for her private ICU room and that highly expensive state-of-the-art experimental treatment protocol the doctors are trying to run." He took another step closer, his dark eyes locking onto mine like a predator cornering a wounded animal. "If you throw that suitcase out that front door," he continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, dangerous whisper, "I will pick up my cell phone right now and call the chief of medicine. I will sign the do not resuscitate order immediately. I will legally revoke all the financial backing for her ongoing treatments, and I will personally instruct them to pull the plug on her ventilator tonight. I can have her completely gone before you even make it back to the hospital parking lot." The large living room suddenly started to spin around me. The warm blood drained completely from my face, leaving me feeling faint and sick to my stomach. I looked deep into his eyes, desperately searching for a bluff, searching for any tiny shred of human decency or fatherly compassion. There was absolutely none to be found. He was entirely serious. He would legally murder his own wife by proxy just to avoid the minor inconvenience of an argument with me over his mistress. So Richard said, stepping back and gesturing casually toward the suitcase, "Let go of the bag right now. Go upstairs to your old childhood room and stay completely out of my way for the rest of the night. Or keep throwing your little emotional tantrum and see exactly what happens to Helen. The choice is entirely yours." My hands went completely numb. My fingers slowly uncurled from the hard plastic handle of the suitcase. The handle hit the hardwood floor with a dull, hollow thud that echoed in the quiet house. It was the exact sound of my personal dignity breaking into pieces. To save my mother's fragile life, I had to swallow the most toxic and bitter humiliation a son could ever face. I had to stand there and let this arrogant man parade his young mistress through my dying mother's home. I stepped back away from the luggage. My head bowed low, my fists clenched so incredibly hard that my fingernails cut deeply into the palms of my hands. I did not say another word to him or to the woman on the couch. I simply turned around and walked slowly toward the main staircase, leaving them to enjoy their expensive champagne in peace. But as I climbed those dark stairs, a massive burning fire ignited deep in my gut. I did not know how yet, but I swore a silent oath to myself that Richard would pay dearly for this ultimate betrayal. Just as I reached the top of the stairs, the heavy oak front door swung open again. I turned around expecting to see my brother. Instead, it was my wife, Claire. She had promised to meet me here to help me gather clothes for the hospital. She walked into the foyer shaking the snow off her expensive designer coat, taking in the bizarre scene of the suitcase, the jazz music, and Richard standing there with Tiffany. Instead of showing shock or disgust, Claire's eyes darted quickly between Richard's relaxed posture and my defeated stance on the staircase. She walked straight past the suitcase and hurried up the stairs to meet me on the landing, grabbing my arm and pulling me roughly into my old bedroom. She slammed the door shut behind us. "What is wrong with you?" Claire hissed at me, her eyes wide with frantic, calculating panic. "Why are you glaring at him like that? Do you want to ruin us?" I stared at the woman I had married 5 years ago, completely bewildered by her reaction. "Claire," I whispered harshly, "did you not just see what is happening down there? My mother is literally suffocating on a hospital bed, and he just moved his 26-year-old girlfriend into her house. He just threatened to pull the plug on her life support if I kick that girl out." Claire waved her hand dismissively, pacing the small bedroom like a caged animal, running the math in her head. "Look, it is terrible, okay? It is a terrible situation. But you need to use your brain for once, Nate. Your mother is not going to make it. The doctors already told us that yesterday. And when she passes, Richard is going to inherit everything. He is going to have total, unchecked control over the entire $80 million commercial real estate portfolio." She stopped pacing and walked right up to my face, her voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper. "Your brother Trent is already kissing up to him every single day at the corporate office. If you make a scene right now and act like the weak, emotional son, Richard will cut us out of the will completely. We will get nothing. You need to go back downstairs, apologize to him, and introduce yourself nicely to Tiffany. We have to play the game, Nate." I felt a cold, dark void open up inside my chest. The betrayal from my father was expected, but the betrayal from my own wife was paralyzing. She did not care about the agonizing disrespect to the woman who had welcomed her into this family. She only cared about securing her future slice of an $80 million pie. "I am not going downstairs to apologize to the man who is holding my mother's life support hostage," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. "And I am definitely not shaking the hand of the mistress sleeping in her bed." Claire glared at me, her face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. "You are always going to be a loser, Nate. You always let your useless morals get in the way of real success. If you ruin this inheritance for me, I swear to God I will make you regret it." I stood completely isolated in my childhood bedroom. My father was destroying my family downstairs. My wife was plotting for cash upstairs, and my mother was dying alone across town. I had never felt so utterly powerless in my entire life. I sat down on the edge of the bed, burying my face in my hands, wishing for some kind of miracle to stop the nightmare. And right at that exact moment, echoing loudly through the massive, quiet house, the front doorbell rang. I stood alone in the dark hallway at the top of the stairs. My breathing was heavy and ragged. I was trapped in a waking nightmare where my own father held my dying mother's life support as a twisted bargaining chip. I desperately needed an ally. I needed a lifeline. Just as the crushing weight of the situation began to completely collapse my lungs, the heavy oak front door swung open downstairs. A sharp rush of freezing winter air swept into the grand foyer, followed immediately by the familiar sharp clicking of high heels against the polished hardwood floor. It was my wife, Claire. She had promised to meet me here to help pack some clean clothes and provisions for my next grueling shift at the hospital. We had been married for 5 long years. They were 5 years of constant compromises, of me trying to balance my modest career as a supply chain analyst with her relentless hunger for a luxury lifestyle we could not quite afford. But in that exact fraction of a second, I did not care about any of our past financial arguments. I just wanted my wife. I needed her to look at me to see the sheer absolute devastation written all over my face and to wrap her arms around me. I needed her to tell me we were going to get through this horrible night together. I watched from the shadows of the upper landing as Claire shook the snow from her expensive wool coat. I waited for her to process the absurd, sickening scene playing out in the living room. I waited for her to see Tiffany, a woman 10 years younger than me, sitting on my mother's custom sofa with a crystal glass of scotch and a massive travel suitcase parked on the Persian rug. I braced myself for Claire's righteous outrage. I expected her to shout, to fiercely demand what on earth my father was doing parading a mistress through this house while the woman who built it was hooked to a ventilator. Instead, Claire did absolutely nothing of the sort. Her posture instantly relaxed. A calculated, highly artificial smile flashed across her face. She gave my father a polite, deferential nod, completely ignoring the blatant, agonizing disrespect happening right in front of her eyes. Then she looked up, spotted me standing paralyzed on the landing, and her fake smile instantly vanished. It was replaced by a look of fierce, frantic panic. She rushed up the stairs, grabbed my forearm with a grip so incredibly tight that her manicured nails dug painfully into my skin, and she dragged me roughly into my old childhood bedroom. She slammed the door shut behind us, cutting off the faint, cheerful sound of the jazz music playing downstairs. Before I could even open my mouth to explain the horror I had just witnessed, Claire turned on me like a cornered viper. Her eyes were wide with a desperate, calculating anger. "What is wrong with you, Nathaniel?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so my father would not hear her through the walls. "Why are you glaring at him like that? Are you actively trying to ruin us?" I stared at the woman I had promised to spend the rest of my life with. My brain completely struggled to process the words coming out of her mouth. "Claire," I whispered, my voice thick with absolute disbelief. "Did you not just see what is happening down there in my mother's own home? She is lying in an intensive care unit suffocating on a machine, and he just moved his 26-year-old girlfriend into her house. He just threatened to legally pull the plug on her life support if I kick that girl out." I truly thought those words would break her. I thought the sheer, undeniable cruelty of my father's threat would snap her back to reality and ignite her empathy. But Claire simply waved her hand in the air, brushing off my mother's impending death as if it were nothing more than a minor scheduling conflict. She paced the small perimeter of the bedroom, acting like a ruthless accountant running complex mathematical equations in her head. "Look, it is terrible," she said, her tone completely devoid of any basic human warmth. "It is a terrible and sad situation, but you need to use your brain for once in your life. Your mother is not going to make it. The doctors already told us that yesterday. And when she passes, Richard is going to inherit absolutely everything." She stopped pacing and stepped right into my personal space, pointing a rigid, accusing finger directly at my chest. "He is going to have total, unchecked control over the entire $80 million commercial real estate portfolio. Your brother Trent is already kissing up to him every single day at the corporate office. Trent is securing his permanent position in the new regime while you are up here throwing a useless emotional tantrum. If you make a scene right now and act like the weak, highly emotional son you always are, Richard will cut us out of the will completely. We will get absolutely nothing. You need to go back downstairs right now, apologize to him, and introduce yourself nicely to Tiffany. We have to play the game, Nate." A cold, dark void opened up deep inside my chest, swallowing whatever tiny shred of hope I had left. The betrayal from my father was one thing. I always knew he was a ruthless, calculating man who valued visible power over human beings. But the betrayal from my own wife was utterly paralyzing. She did not care about the agonizing disrespect to the woman who had welcomed her into this family with open arms. She did not care that my mother was dying completely alone across town. All Claire saw was an $80 million pie, and she was terrified my personal grief was going to cost her a lucrative slice. She was perfectly willing to let my father trample on my mother's dignity as long as the inheritance checks eventually cleared. "I am not going downstairs to apologize to the man who is holding my mother's life support hostage," I said. My voice was dangerously low, vibrating with a quiet, absolute certainty. "And I am definitely not shaking the hand of the mistress who is currently planning to sleep in her bed. I would rather walk away from this family with absolutely nothing than sell out my own mother for a payout." Claire glared at me, her face twisting into a harsh mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. This was the real Claire. The polite, supportive mask was finally off. "You are always going to be a loser, Nate." She spat her words, dripping with a toxic venom that burned my ears. "You always let your useless, pathetic morals get in the way of real success. You would rather be right than be rich. Well, I am not throwing my future away just because you cannot handle reality. If you ruin this inheritance for me, I swear I will make you regret it for the rest of your life." I stood completely isolated in the center of the room I grew up in. The walls felt like they were physically closing in on me. My father was systematically destroying my family downstairs. My wife was plotting for a selfish cash grab upstairs. My mother was taking her final mechanical breaths in a cold, sterile hospital room. I had never felt so utterly powerless, so deeply alone in my entire existence. I had no allies left. I had no safe harbor. Everyone I trusted had a financial price tag, and my mother's legacy was apparently the currency they were trading. I sank down onto the edge of the old mattress, burying my face in my trembling hands. I wished for the floor to simply open up and swallow me whole. I wished for some kind of sudden miracle to stop the nightmare from advancing any further. And right at that exact moment, slicing through the heavy, suffocating tension of the house, the front doorbell rang. The silence inside my childhood bedroom felt heavy enough to crush my lungs. Claire stood by the window with her arms crossed tight, her face set in a hard mask of pure calculation. She had drawn her line in the sand, and my mother was entirely on the wrong side of it. I slowly stood up from the edge of the mattress, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I needed a glass of water to wash down the bitter taste of utter defeat. Stepping out onto the landing, I could hear my father's booming voice echoing up the staircase. He was not grieving, he was holding court. I paused on the top step, gripping the wooden banister so hard my knuckles turned white. Down in the foyer, Tiffany had already dragged her massive suitcase toward the base of the stairs. She was humming a cheerful pop song while unzipping the front pocket, completely oblivious to the tragedy hanging over the house. Richard stood nearby, leaning casually against the archway with his crystal glass in hand. "Did you see the look on his face?" He chuckled, his voice dripping with condescension. He folded like a cheap suit. "I told you, Tiff. Nathaniel has absolutely no spine. He takes after his mother that way. They both just let the world happen to them. You have nothing to worry about. This house is yours now." Every word was a physical strike to my jaw. I closed my eyes, fighting the overwhelming urge to charge down those stairs and tear him apart. But the image of my mother lying helpless on a ventilator flashed in my mind. I was a hostage in my own life. Before Tiffany could reply, a sharp, piercing sound sliced through the quiet luxury of the house. The front doorbell rang. It chimed twice, loud and demanding, completely shattering the comfortable little reality my father was trying to build for his mistress. Richard frowned, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He looked up and caught me standing in the shadows of the second-floor landing. "Well, go get the door, Nate," he ordered, waving his free hand as if dismissing a hired servant. "Tell whoever it is that we are dealing with a private family tragedy and cannot be disturbed." I descended the stairs slowly, my boots heavy on the polished wood. I walked right past Tiffany, ignoring the smug little smirk she gave me as she pulled a handful of expensive silk dresses from her luggage. I reached the heavy front door and pulled it open, expecting to find a nosy neighbor or perhaps a late-night delivery driver who had gotten terribly lost in our upscale subdivision. Instead, a tall, impeccably dressed older man stood on the porch under the glow of the exterior lights. He wore a sharp charcoal overcoat and held a thick leather briefcase tightly against his side. The winter wind was howling behind him, but he stood completely motionless, his expression carved from stone. I instantly recognized him. It was Mr. Sterling. He was a senior partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in the city and had been my mother's private estate attorney for over a decade. "Good evening, Nathaniel," Mr. Sterling said smoothly, stepping out of the freezing cold and into the warm foyer without waiting for an invitation. "I apologize for the extremely late hour, but the matters I bring are exceptionally time-sensitive." Richard heard the voice and strolled into the entryway, his relaxed demeanor instantly vanishing. His jaw tightened as his eyes locked onto the leather briefcase in Sterling's hand. "Sterling," my father barked, his tone suddenly sharp and defensive. "What on earth are you doing at my house in the middle of the night? My wife is currently in the intensive care unit on life support. This is a time for family healing, not uninvited legal solicitors." Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He calmly unbuttoned his overcoat and met my father's hostile gaze with cold professional indifference. "I am well aware of Helen's tragic medical situation, Richard," the lawyer replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "That is precisely why I am standing in your foyer at this hour." Richard let out a harsh, patronizing laugh, stepping forward to establish dominance. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate the older attorney. "Listen to me very closely," my father warned, pointing a rigid finger at Sterling. "Helen is incapacitated. I am her legal husband. I hold her complete medical power of attorney, and I exercise total executive control over every single piece of property, every bank account, and every legal matter in this family. Whatever irrelevant paperwork you brought with you tonight is completely useless. You can deal directly with my corporate lawyers in the morning. Now get out of my house." Tiffany stopped unpacking her silk dresses. Claire, having heard the commotion, crept halfway down the stairs, watching the confrontation with greedy, wide eyes. Everyone in the room waited for the lawyer to back down and apologize. Mr. Sterling simply opened his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in a heavy blue folder. "You are incredibly mistaken about your level of authority here," Richard Sterling said, his voice dropping into a deadly clinical register. "Helen anticipated exactly how you would behave the moment she could no longer speak for herself. 3 days before she suffered her stroke, she summoned me to a private meeting. She executed a comprehensive, legally binding, irrevocable trust transfer." The color drained entirely from my father's face. The arrogant sneer wiped away, replaced by genuine shock. "What are you talking about?" Richard stammered, stepping back as if the blue folder was suddenly radiating heat. "She cannot do that without my signature. I control the primary marital assets." "Helen transferred assets that were held solely in her maiden name," Sterling corrected him sharply. "Assets you were completely blind to. This legal maneuver explicitly and permanently bypasses you, your corporate lawyers, and your assumed power of attorney. You have absolutely zero jurisdiction over what is inside this folder." The sheer reality of losing control sent Richard over the edge. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He lunged forward, grabbing Mr. Sterling roughly by the lapels of his charcoal overcoat. "You slimy, manipulative hack," my father roared, spittle flying from his lips as he shoved the older man back against the heavy wooden door. "I will destroy your career for coming into my home and pulling a stunt like this. I am throwing you out onto the street right now." I took a step forward to intervene. Terrified my father was about to seriously injure the man, but Mr. Sterling held up a calm, steady hand to stop me. He looked down at the fists gripping his coat and then looked directly into Richard's eyes. "If you do not remove your hands from my person this very second, Richard, I will step outside and make a single phone call," Sterling whispered with terrifying precision. "I will have the local police here in 5 minutes to arrest you for assault. And tomorrow morning, long before the stock market even opens, I will file an emergency injunction based on Helen's sworn affidavits regarding your financial misconduct. I will have a federal judge freeze every single one of your corporate accounts, your commercial real estate holdings, and your personal credit lines. By noon, you will not even be able to buy a cup of coffee." My father froze. His hands trembled violently against the fabric of the lawyer's coat. The room fell into a suffocating dead silence. For the first time in my entire life, I watched the great, untouchable Richard Hayes realize he was entirely outmatched. He slowly released his grip, taking a defeated step backward. The tension in the grand foyer was thick enough to choke on when the heavy brass knocker on the front door suddenly echoed through the house. I jumped slightly, my nerves completely frayed from the relentless emotional assault. Richard frowned, clearly annoyed that his victory parade was being interrupted. He marched over to the door and yanked it open, expecting a neighbor or a delivery driver. Standing on the frozen front porch was Mr. Sterling. He was my mother's private estate attorney, a stern, impeccably dressed man in his late 60s who carried a worn leather briefcase. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, brushing past Richard and ignoring Tiffany entirely. His expression was cold and strictly professional. "What are you doing here at this hour, Sterling?" my father demanded, stepping firmly into the lawyer's path. "Helen is in a medically induced coma. I am her husband. I hold the medical power of attorney, and I control all the legal matters for this family. Whatever you are selling, you can pass it through my corporate legal team in the morning." Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked Richard directly in the eye. "Helen fully anticipated this exact reaction from you, Richard. That is precisely why she asked me to come here tonight. 3 days before she suffered her stroke and slipped into the coma, she executed a hidden, irrevocable trust transfer. She explicitly commanded me to deliver the terms to all present parties the moment her medical prognosis became terminal." Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh, crossing his arms over his chest. "A hidden trust. Please. I track every single dollar that moves through our accounts. She had absolutely nothing that I did not personally approve of. Get out of my house before I call the police for trespassing. I highly advise against that," Sterling replied, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "The documents in my briefcase bypass your authority entirely. If you attempt to lay a hand on me or throw me out of this house, I will have a federal judge freeze every single corporate account tied to your real estate LLCs by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Do you truly want to test the strength of your wife's final legal maneuvers?" The arrogant smirk vanished from my father's face. The color drained slightly from his cheeks as the severe reality of the lawyer's threat set in. Richard knew exactly how much damage a frozen corporate account could do to his daily operations. He stepped aside, gesturing aggressively toward the formal dining room. "Fine," Richard spat. "Read your little fairy tale. Let us get this over with so I can go to sleep." Just as we gathered in the grand foyer, the front door opened again. My older brother Trent walked in. Trent was the golden child, the perfect replica of my father. He wore a tailored wool suit and a smug expression that suggested he owned the world. He took one look at the lawyer, smirked at me, and leaned against the wall, ready for a show. Sterling unlocked his leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of heavy blue ink legal documents. "To my husband, Richard Hayes," the lawyer read aloud, his voice cutting through the dead silence of the house. "I grant the full operating control of the commercial property LLCs. You will retain management of the buildings you so deeply value." Richard smiled widely, wrapping his arm around Tiffany's waist. He looked at me with a triumphant glare. "Exactly as it should be," he whispered. Sterling turned the page. "To my eldest son, Trent Hayes, I leave the liquid investment portfolio valued at $5 million. You have always sought financial independence, and this will secure your immediate future." Trent let out a loud whoop of pure joy, pumping his fist in the air. "Yes," he shouted, pulling out his cell phone to undoubtedly check his banking app. Claire gripped my arm so tightly I thought my bone would snap. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid. She was waiting for the grand finale. She was waiting for my share of the $80 million empire. And finally, to my youngest son, Nathaniel Sterling, continued looking up from the documents and locking eyes with me. I leave the contents of this envelope and the sole responsibility for the attached liability. Sterling walked over and handed me a small, incredibly light manila envelope. My hands shook as I opened the flap. I reached inside and pulled out a single heavily rusted metal key. It had a cheap, faded plastic tag attached to it bearing the name of a rural credit union located 3 hours away in farm country. I reached back into the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of official county paper. It was a formal tax transfer notice. The document explicitly stated that a commercial property tax debt of exactly $75,000 had been legally transferred directly into my name, effective immediately upon the hour of my mother's passing. I stared at the bold black numbers printed on the page. My brain violently rejected the reality of what I was reading. $75,000 in debt, no cash, no corporate shares, no real estate. Just a rusted piece of metal and a massive financial anchor tied directly around my neck. The silence in the foyer broke when Trent leaned over, snatched the paper from my frozen hands, and read the balance out loud. For a split second, nobody moved. Then the laughter started. Trent threw his head back and barked with uncontrollable amusement. Tiffany let out a high-pitched and mocking giggle, covering her mouth with her hand. But the worst reaction came from my father. Richard Hayes looked at me with an expression of absolute and crushing vindication. He stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger right at my face. "You see that, Nate?" My father chuckled, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "Helen always knew exactly what you were. She knew you were a walking liability. You could never handle real business, and you could never handle real money. She gave the empire to me, she gave the wealth to your brother, and she gave you a pile of garbage debt because that is exactly what your life is worth." He wrapped his arm around Tiffany's waist, pulling her close to his side. "You have a massive tax bill due, son. You better get out of my house and start picking up some extra shifts at the warehouse to pay it off." The humiliation burned through my veins like battery acid. I was standing in the home I grew up in, being laughed at by the people who shared my blood while holding a debt that would instantly ruin my entire financial future. The crushing weight of the moment threatened to snap my spine in half. I looked desperately at Claire, praying for her to defend me, but the pure horror I saw on her face told me the nightmare was only just beginning. The biting winter air whipping across the driveway felt like an absolute blessing compared to the toxic atmosphere I had just escaped in the foyer. I walked rapidly toward my car, my boots crunching heavily against the frozen pavement. I needed the silence. I needed exactly one moment to process the fact that my mother was dying alone on a ventilator while my own flesh and blood openly celebrated my financial destruction. But silence was a luxury I simply was not going to get. Claire matched my frantic pace step for step, her heels aggressively striking the concrete. The instant we both slid into the freezing cabin of my sedan and slammed the heavy doors shut, she exploded. Before I could even put my key into the ignition to turn on the heater, Claire lunged across the center console. She snatched the small manila envelope straight out of my frozen hands. She ripped the flap open, pulled out the thick county document, and flicked on the bright overhead cabin light. I sat there in stunned silence, watching her eyes frantically scan the dense legal paragraphs and the bold black numbers printed at the bottom of the page. $75,000. She whispered the amount first, her voice a hollow, trembling rasp of pure disbelief. Then her entire demeanor shifted into blinding rage. $75,000 in commercial tax debt, Nathaniel. Are you actually out of your mind? She violently shoved the heavy paper directly into my chest. It slid down into my lap like a physical death sentence. You did not just get disinherited tonight, she screamed, her voice piercing the tight confines of the car. You got financially obliterated. I kept my hands firmly gripped on the cold leather steering wheel, staring straight ahead through the frosted windshield. Claire, please just stop, I said quietly. My mother is literally suffocating in an intensive care unit right now. I cannot possibly deal with this money issue tonight. But Claire was entirely incapable of human empathy when her financial security was threatened. She unbuckled her seatbelt and twisted her entire body to face me, her eyes burning with an intense, calculating hatred. Do not you dare use your dying mother as a convenient excuse, she shouted. This is not about her. This is about you being utterly incapable of playing the corporate game. Your brother Trent walked away with $5 million in liquid cash. Richard retained complete control over an $80 million commercial real estate portfolio. And what do you have? My so-called brilliant husband, the highly educated supply chain analyst. You walked away with a rusted piece of junk metal and a massive tax lien that is going to completely destroy our credit scores by tomorrow morning. You are actively dragging me down into bankruptcy because you are far too proud to stroke your own father's ego. Before I could even form a sentence to defend myself against her vicious attack, Claire grabbed her smartphone from her designer purse. She furiously tapped the glowing screen and hit the speakerphone button, turning the volume all the way up. I heard the dial tone ring twice before a slick, overly confident voice answered the call. It was her older brother, Brad. Brad was a wildly arrogant local commercial real estate broker. He drove a leased European sports car and made it his personal mission to brag about his commission checks at every single family gathering. "What is going on?" Little Sister Brad answered cheerfully, the sound of loud music pumping in the background of his call. "Tell me the good news. Did the old man finally pass out the golden tickets?" Claire let out a dry, bitter sob that sounded entirely forced. "No, Brad," she cried into the microphone. "Richard gave the entire fortune to Trent. He gave Nate a $75,000 commercial property tax debt. He legally transferred the liability straight into Nate's personal name." There was a brief, heavy pause on the line. Then Brad erupted into a booming, obnoxious laugh that completely filled the interior of my freezing car. "Oh my God," Brad chuckled mercilessly. "The old man actually weaponized a commercial tax lien against his own son. That is absolutely ruthless. I told you, Claire. I told you 5 years ago when you married him that the guy was a total black sheep loser. He has absolutely zero killer instinct. Listen to me very carefully. If he gets slapped with a commercial lien of that magnitude, the county is going to drain your joint savings and garnish his miserable corporate salary before the month is over. You need to cut your losses and run right now before his toxic debt ruins your pristine credit profile." Claire ended the call abruptly, tossing her phone onto the dark dashboard. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and glared at me with absolute icy detachment. "Brad is absolutely right," she said, her voice completely devoid of the woman I thought I loved. "I am not spending the prime years of my life paying off a massive penalty just because you are too weak to secure your own rightful inheritance. So here is exactly what is going to happen right now," she commanded. "You are going to take your hands off that steering wheel. You are going to march right back through that front door, and you are going to get down on your knees and beg your father for a management job at the corporate office. You will explicitly offer to sign that tax liability directly over to his holding company, and you will eagerly agree to whatever humiliating terms he demands. You will do it tonight." I turned my head slowly and looked at the woman sitting next to me. The dim amber glow of the streetlights illuminated the greedy, desperate lines on her face. She was explicitly demanding that I crawl back into a house where my dying mother was currently being replaced by a girl 10 years younger than me. She wanted me to bow down and surrender to a man who had just threatened to murder his own wife by pulling her life support. "Claire," I said, my voice completely stripped of any warmth or affection, "I will never bow to a man who treats my mother like disposable garbage. I am not going back inside that house." Claire stared at me for 3 long, agonizing seconds. "Fine," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh final whisper. "Then we are entirely done." The sharp click of the deadbolt locking behind me sounded like the final gavel striking in a sterile courtroom. Claire did not just ask me to step outside to cool off and collect my thoughts. She marched me straight out to the front porch, coldly demanded my house key, and shut the heavy wooden door directly in my face. I stood on the frozen concrete step, staring through the frosted glass panels of my own home, watching the warm yellow light fade to black as she flipped the entryway switch. The bitter winter wind whipped right through my thin jacket, but the violent physical cold was nothing compared to the absolute hollow shock rapidly expanding inside my chest. I walked down the dark driveway and climbed into my freezing sedan. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely guide the metal key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, struggled against the freezing temperature, and finally roared to life, blowing a stream of icy air out of the dashboard vents. I desperately needed a plan. I needed a cheap, quiet motel room to ride out the night so I could wake up the next morning, hire an aggressive lawyer, and somehow begin to fix this catastrophic mess. I pulled out my cell phone and opened my primary banking application. I just needed to transfer a few $100s from our joint savings account into my personal checking to secure a warm bed and a hot meal. The blue loading circle spun for a few agonizing seconds. When the numbers finally populated on the glowing digital screen, my heart stopped completely. Available balance $0.00. I blinked hard, rubbing my tired, burning eyes, assuming the application was experiencing a late-night network glitch. I refreshed the page. The numbers remained identical. I clicked into the recent transaction history and saw the devastating truth immediately. Just 3 minutes ago, while she was actively screaming at me in the car, Claire had initiated a massive expedited outbound wire transfer. She ruthlessly drained every single penny we had saved over the last 5 years and moved the entire sum into an external account that I did not recognize. She had financially gutted me before I even stepped out of the vehicle, before the crushing reality of her financial theft could even fully register in my exhausted mind. An automated notification popped up at the top of my phone screen. It was an urgent alert from my credit monitoring service. Then came a second alert and a third, flooding my screen in a rapid, terrifying sequence of panic. The $75,000 commercial tax liability was not just a harmless piece of paper inside a manila envelope. Mr. Sterling had already filed the official deed transfer with the county records office the exact moment my mother slipped into her coma, strictly following the instructions of her hidden trust. The county automated system had instantly processed the massive property tax debt against my Social Security number. It was recorded as a severe, outstanding derogatory mark. My pristine credit score was currently in an absolute freefall. I quickly pulled out my wallet and grabbed my primary credit card. I dialed the automated customer service line, desperately hoping I could request a fast cash advance at a nearby automated teller machine. The robotic female voice on the other end of the line was painfully cheerful as it informed me that my account had been restricted due to a sudden and severe negative change in my credit profile. I tried my second credit card. Restricted. I pulled out my emergency backup card. It was frozen entirely due to suspicious liability activity. The banking algorithms did not care that my mother was dying. They did not care that my wife had just robbed me blind and thrown me out into the snow. They only saw a sudden, terrifying tax lien attached to my name and immediately locked me out of the entire financial system to protect their corporate assets. I sat motionless in the driver's seat, the cheap plastic dashboard illuminated by the harsh, mocking glow of my ruined financial life. I was a professional supply chain analyst. I spent 40 hours a week auditing massive corporate ledgers and calculating complex financial risks for retail distributors. Yet here I was, completely outsmarted and stripped bare by the people I shared a dinner table with. I had absolutely no money, no access to credit, and no roof over my head. I was reduced to a ghost sitting in a freezing car. The digital dashboard clock read 2:14 in the morning. I rested my heavy forehead against the cold leather steering wheel, trying to manually regulate my ragged breathing. I told myself I just needed to survive the next few hours. I would drive back to the city hospital, sit in the warm waiting room, and figure everything out when the sun came up. Then my cell phone vibrated violently against the center console. The caller identification displayed the main switchboard number for the hospital. A sickening wave of dread washed over my entire body, making my stomach churn. I picked up the phone, my thumb hesitating for a fraction of a second before accepting the incoming call. "Nathaniel Hayes," I answered, my voice reduced to a barely audible whisper. "Mr. Hayes, this is Dr. Evans from the intensive care unit," the female voice on the other end said. The tone was strictly clinical, completely devoid of any comforting bedside manner. I am calling to officially inform you that your mother, Helen Hayes, passed away exactly 14 minutes ago." The heavy words echoed in the tight, freezing cabin of my car. I could not breathe. I could not form a single rational thought. What happened? I choked out, tears instantly welling in my eyes. "She was entirely stable when I left the ward. You specifically told me the experimental treatments were keeping her vital signs elevated." Dr. Evans paused, the heavy silence stretching out like an eternity over the cellular connection. "Your father arrived at the hospital an hour ago," the doctor finally explained. As the primary holder of the medical power of attorney, he exercised his legal right to refuse all further medical interventions. He officially canceled the funding for the experimental protocol and signed a do not resuscitate order on the spot. We were legally obligated to step back and turn off the machines. The transition was very quick. "I am profoundly sorry for your loss." The line went dead. The automated beep of the disconnected call sounded exactly like a flatline monitor ringing directly inside my ear. I dropped the phone onto the empty passenger seat. My father had actually done it. He made good on his horrific, monstrous threat. Because I had dared to challenge his absolute authority, because I refused to smile and shake hands with his young mistress, he drove straight to the hospital and executed my mother. He pulled the financial backing out from under her struggling body just to prove a sadistic point. He wanted to show me the absolute terrifying extent of his unchecked power. I screamed. I slammed my fists into the steering wheel again and again until my knuckles were bruised and aching. The sharp physical pain was the only thing anchoring me to reality. The tears burned hot against my freezing cheeks as I stared out into the dark, empty residential street. My father had casually murdered my mother to protect his fragile ego. My wife had stolen my entire life savings to protect her own lavish comfort. My brother was currently sleeping soundly with a $5 million safety net waiting for him in the morning, and I was sitting entirely alone in the freezing winter darkness. I was grieving a mother I could not save. I was homeless. I was utterly broke. And I was securely anchored to a massive mountain of government debt that I had no earthly way of paying. They had aggressively pushed me all the way to the very bottom of the abyss. They naturally assumed I would just lie there in the dark and quietly accept my complete destruction. They thought stripping away my money and my pride would leave me broken forever. But as I sat there shivering in the freezing cold, the devastating grief slowly began to harden into something entirely different. It solidified into a cold, unbreakable, and terrifying resolve. The brutal winter cold did not just chill my skin. It sank deep into my bones and settled in my joints like crushed glass. I woke up shivering violently in the cramped back seat of my Honda Civic, surrounded by a sprawling retail parking lot. The harsh fluorescent security lights glared through the frosted windows, casting long and mocking shadows across the cheap upholstery. 48 hours ago, I was a respected supply chain analyst with a warm home, a wife, and a mother who was still fighting to live. Now my entire existence was confined to a freezing metal box, smelling faintly of stale air and exhaust fumes. I pulled my thin jacket tighter around my shoulders, my breath forming thick white clouds in the freezing cabin. The absolute silence of the early morning felt suffocating. It left entirely too much room for the agonizing reality of my mother's death to replay in my head. The sudden and harsh vibration of my cell phone against the hard plastic center console made me jump. The glaring screen illuminated the dark interior, displaying a rapid and relentless stream of incoming text messages. They were from my brother Trent. I rubbed my exhausted and burning eyes and unlocked the device, expecting perhaps a rare moment of sibling solidarity in the wake of our mother's passing. I could not have been more wrong. The messages were a masterclass in psychological cruelty. Trent was eagerly outlining the elaborate and sickeningly lavish funeral arrangements my father was orchestrating. Richard had apparently booked the largest and most prestigious cathedral in the downtown commercial district. He had hired an upscale public relations firm to manage the entire guest list, ensuring every major local politician and corporate real estate mogul would be in attendance. It was not a memorial service to honor a beloved woman. It was a highly orchestrated networking event designed entirely to portray Richard as the tragic and devoted patriarch. The final message from Trent was a direct and vicious ultimatum. He explicitly ordered me to stay far away from the press cameras. I was strictly banned from the main family seating area. If I dared to show my face, I was instructed to slip through the side doors, sit quietly in the very back row, and keep my mouth completely shut. If I caused any disruptions, their private security team would physically remove me from the premises. They were actively erasing my mother's true legacy, replacing her authentic life with a shallow corporate photo opportunity, and making sure I was pushed entirely into the shadows. A deep and nauseating wave of grief washed over me, but it was quickly interrupted by the sharp and undeniable pain of an empty stomach. I had not eaten a real meal in 3 days. The bitter cold was draining my energy reserves rapidly, and I desperately needed something warm just to keep my hands from shaking. I stepped out of the car, my stiff legs trembling as they hit the icy pavement, and walked slowly toward the massive retail supercenter. The artificial lights inside the store felt blinding. I walked straight to the small kiosk near the front entrance and grabbed a plain black coffee in a cheap paper cup. The warmth radiating through the cardboard was the only comforting physical sensation I had felt all night. I approached the register and pulled out my debit card. I knew Claire had drained our joint savings, but I prayed there might be just enough residual funds in my primary checking to cover a $2 beverage. I slid the plastic card into the machine. The digital terminal beeped loudly, displaying an insufficient funds notice. The cashier, a tired-looking teenager, sighed and looked away as a small line formed behind me. I tried my emergency credit card next, knowing it was a massive gamble. The screen flashed bright red with an instant fraud restriction alert. The automated tax lien had completely obliterated my financial standing overnight. The heat of total humiliation flooded my cheeks. I had to apologize softly, leave the steaming cup of coffee on the counter, and walk away with absolutely nothing. I retreated back out into the freezing parking lot and locked myself inside the dark car. I reached into the glove compartment and found a crushed packet of stale saltine crackers. I ate them slowly in the dark, washing the dry crumbs down with a half-empty bottle of freezing water. This was my new reality. This was the absolute bottom of the abyss. Seeking any possible distraction from the gnawing hunger and the biting cold, I opened my phone and blindly scrolled through social media. The algorithmic feed refreshed, and the very first image that popped onto my screen struck me like a physical blow. It was a photograph posted just an hour ago by Claire's brother Brad. The location tag was an exclusive and notoriously expensive steakhouse downtown. There, sitting around a massive table littered with empty cocktail glasses and premium seafood towers, were Claire, Brad, and Trent. They were laughing. They were raising their expensive drinks to the camera, their faces glowing with opportunistic greed. The caption beneath the photo read that big moves were happening tonight with the best crew and offered cheers to the future. My mother was barely cold in her hospital bed. I was currently starving in a retail parking lot with a ruined credit score. And my wife was actively celebrating with the exact people who had just orchestrated my complete destruction. She had seamlessly attached herself to Trent, securing her proximity to my father's $80 million empire. She did not just abandon me in my darkest hour. She joined the enemy camp the exact second the financial scales tipped in their favor. Staring at that sickening photograph in the freezing darkness of my car, something fundamental inside me finally shifted. The suffocating weight of my grief and the paralyzing sting of my public humiliation began to crystallize. The desperate urge to simply give up vanished completely. They had stripped me of my home, my money, and my dignity, assuming I would just fade away into absolute obscurity. They underestimated the very thing my mother had always valued in me: I tossed the empty water bottle aside and gripped the steering wheel tightly. I was going to find out exactly what that rusted key opened, and I was going to use it to tear their fake and arrogant world apart piece by piece. Dawn arrived without a single ounce of warmth. The bleak morning sun crawled over the concrete horizon of the retail parking lot, casting a harsh and pale light into my freezing vehicle. My body ached deeply from sleeping contorted in the back seat of my Honda, and my stomach twisted with a sharp, hollow cramp. I sat up slowly, my breath fogging the cold windows. On the passenger seat, resting right next to my completely empty water bottle, was the manila envelope. The faded plastic tag attached to the rusted piece of metal bore the name of a regional credit union located in Oakhaven, a tiny agricultural town nearly 3 hours away. I had an agonizing choice to make right then and there. I could admit total defeat. I could call the bankruptcy lawyers, walk into my father's gleaming corporate lobby with my head bowed in submission, and beg Richard for a mid-level desk job just to keep a roof over my head. Claire would likely take me back the exact second I submitted to the family wealth. But submitting meant allowing my father to legally erase my mother's existence and validate his absolute cruelty. I pulled my worn leather wallet from my pocket and flipped it open. Slipped behind my frozen, useless credit cards was a single crumpled $20 bill. It was my emergency stash, and it was the very last piece of physical currency I possessed in the world. I climbed over into the driver's seat, shoved my key into the ignition, and watched the fuel gauge flutter weakly near the empty line. $20 would buy me just enough cheap, unleaded gas to make the drive out to Oakhaven, provided there was no major traffic on the interstate. It was a one-way ticket. If this safe deposit box held nothing but a symbolic trinket or another financial trap set by my father, I would be entirely stranded in the middle of nowhere. I gripped the steering wheel, took a long and steadying breath, and put the car in drive. I left the city limits behind me, watching the towering glass and steel monuments of my father's commercial real estate empire fade away in the rearview mirror. The landscape gradually shifted from sprawling suburban developments to endless snow-covered cornfields and barren agricultural stretches. The highway felt incredibly lonely. My car heater blew a weak stream of lukewarm air, barely cutting through the biting winter chill creeping up through the floorboards. For 3 hours, I drove in absolute silence, rationing my fuel by coasting down the long highway hills. My mind raced with a million terrifying scenarios. My mother was a brilliant and highly pragmatic woman. She never did anything without a calculated reason. She knew my father was a predator, and she knew the exact moment her heart stopped, I would be thrown into the deep end without a life vest. That rusted key was not a mistake. Oakhaven was a forgotten casualty of modern corporate economics. The main street was lined with boarded-up storefronts, an old hardware shop, and a diner with a flickering neon sign. I navigated the bumpy, pothole-ridden rural roads until my GPS directed me toward a small, single-story brick building sitting on a quiet corner. A weathered wooden sign out front read, Oakhaven Farmers Credit Union. It looked like a relic completely untouched by the last 4 decades. Just as I turned my steering wheel to pull into the cracked asphalt parking lot, my dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. The check engine light flashed frantically. A loud, violent, metallic grinding noise erupted from deep beneath the hood, followed instantly by a thick plume of gray smoke pouring out of the front grille. The engine choked, sputtered, and died completely. I lost my power steering, forcing me to wrestle the dead weight of the vehicle just to coast it safely into a snow-covered parking space. The car lurched to a sudden and violent halt. I sat there in the deafening quiet, staring at the thick smoke curling up against the frosted windshield. I was now completely stranded. My last $20 was burned up in the fuel tank, my car was permanently dead, and I had absolutely zero means to pay a tow truck. I grabbed the manila envelope, shoved open my heavy door, and stepped out into the freezing wind. I caught my reflection in the side mirror and barely recognized the man looking back at me. I was wearing the same wrinkled slacks and gray pullover I had worn in the intensive care unit 2 days ago. My face was pale shadowed with coarse stubble, and my eyes were completely bloodshot from grief and pure exhaustion. I smelled strongly of burnt engine oil and stale sweat. I looked exactly like the pathetic, destitute loser my wife and father had proclaimed me to be. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the credit union. The interior smelled distinctly of old paper floor wax and instant coffee. There were no sleek marble counters or digital displays here, just a few wooden desks and faded carpet. I walked up to the only teller on duty, a stern-looking older woman with silver hair tied tight in a bun and thick reading glasses resting on a beaded chain around her neck. She looked up from her computer monitor, her eyes scanning my disheveled appearance with immediate and overt suspicion. I did not say a word. I simply reached into the envelope, pulled out the rusted key, and placed it onto the scratched laminate counter. The teller frowned, leaning forward to inspect the cheap plastic tag. She typed a sequence of numbers into her ancient desktop computer, her brow furrowing deeper with every keystroke. After a long minute, she looked back up at me, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "This box number does not exist in our digital database," she said, her voice dry and incredibly dismissive. "I am sorry, sir, but you must have the wrong institution." I planted my hands firmly on the counter, refusing to move a single inch. "My mother banked here," I said, my voice hoarse but completely steady. "Her name was Helen Hayes. Please, you need to check the physical records." The woman stared at me clearly, debating whether to call the local police to remove a vagrant from her lobby. But something in the sheer desperate intensity of my gaze must have registered. She let out a heavy sigh, grabbed a massive ring of master keys from her drawer, and turned toward a heavy steel door at the back of the room. "It is going to take me a while to dig through the basement paper archives," she warned over her shoulder. "Do not move from that spot." I stood completely frozen in the quiet lobby, my heart hammering fiercely against my ribs, waiting to see if my mother had left me a lifeline or an empty grave. The stern teller emerged from the heavy steel door at the back of the lobby. She carried a long, rectangular metal lockbox in her hands. The dark green paint on the container was chipped and severely worn, bearing the faded painted numbers 804. She did not say a word as she walked past me, gesturing for me to follow her down a narrow, poorly lit hallway. My heart was pounding so violently against my ribs that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. We stepped into a tiny, windowless viewing room containing nothing but a cheap laminate table and a single plastic chair. She placed the heavy metal box onto the table, inserted a master key into the left side of the dual lock mechanism, and turned it with a loud mechanical clank. She then motioned for my rusted key. I slid it into the right side and turned it. The teller stepped out of the small room and pulled the heavy door shut behind her, leaving me completely alone in the suffocating silence. I stood over the metal container for a long time. My frozen hands were shaking so badly I had to clench them into tight fists just to steady my nerves. This was it. This was the absolute final lifeline my mother had left me. I closed my eyes and prayed for a stack of emergency cash. I prayed for a few gold coins, a hidden savings bond, or absolutely anything I could quickly liquidate to fix my broken car engine and secure a warm bed for the night. I took a deep breath, hooked my fingers under the cold metal latch, and slowly lifted the heavy lid. The hinges let out a sharp metallic squeal. I looked inside, and the tiny, fragile spark of hope keeping me alive instantly extinguished. There was no cash. There were no diamonds, no bundles of $100 bills, no precious family heirlooms. The bottom of the box was entirely covered in dust. Resting in the center of the dark metal floor was a thick bound stack of incredibly old legal documents. The heavy parchment paper was severely yellowed at the edges. I reached in and pulled the massive stack out. The top page featured a highly formal, typewritten legal header stamped with an official county seal dating all the way back to 1982. The ink on the signature lines was a faded, vibrant blue. It was just paper. A massive pile of ancient, irrelevant paper. My chest caved in completely. I dropped the heavy documents onto the laminate table, a bitter laugh escaping my dry throat. My mother had actually left me nothing but old reading material while my wife slept comfortably in a warm bed and my brother counted his $5 million portfolio. But as the heavy stack of contracts hit the table, a smaller, pristine white envelope slipped out from between the thick pages and fluttered down to the floor. I bent down slowly and picked it up. My name, Nathaniel, was written across the front in a perfectly elegant, sweeping cursive script. It was my mother's handwriting. A fresh wave of tears instantly flooded my eyes. I carefully broke the seal of the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of premium stationery hidden inside. The scent of her subtle floral perfume still lingered on the paper, hitting my senses and completely breaking my heart all over again. My dearest Nate, the letter began. If you are sitting in a quiet room reading these words right now, it means my physical body has finally failed and my beautiful boy has been pushed to the absolute edge of his endurance. I know exactly what your father did today. I know he tried to break your spirit, and I know he paraded his newly acquired trophies in front of you. He is a deeply predictable man. I stopped reading for a second, my mind completely reeling. She knew. Even before the stroke ravaged her brain, my mother possessed an absolute razor-sharp awareness of the true monster she was married to. I wiped my burning eyes with the back of my filthy sleeve and continued reading her elegant words. I have known about Richard's chronic infidelities for over a decade. Her letter continued smoothly. I knew about the young women, the expensive hotel charges hidden in corporate expense reports, and the shallow arrogance he used to disguise his own deep insecurities. I stayed silent, Nathaniel. I swallowed my pride year after year, not because I was a weak woman, but because I was actively playing an incredibly long and calculated game to protect your future. The words on the page seemed to vibrate with a quiet, terrifying power. I pulled the single sheet of paper closer to the dim overhead light. Your father believes he is a self-made titan, she wrote. He truly believes his massive commercial real estate empire is a pure manifestation of his own unyielding brilliance. He loves the shiny glass buildings, the massive corporate headquarters, and the flashy ribbon-cutting ceremonies. But Richard has a fatal blind spot, Nate. He is so utterly obsessed with the physical structures he builds, reaching up into the sky, that he never bothers to look down at the dirt beneath his expensive leather shoes. He despises reading the fine print. He assumes his loud voice and intimidating posture can override any binding legal contract. I glanced nervously down at the thick stack of yellowed legal documents resting on the table. My heart began to accelerate, pumping a totally new kind of adrenaline through my exhausted veins. I did not leave you a pile of cash, my son, because Richard would have tied you up in a decade of frivolous corporate litigation trying to steal every single penny back from you. I could not leave you money. I had to leave you leverage. I had to leave you the one singular thing your father absolutely cannot bully, intimidate, or negotiate his way out of. Look closely at those blue ink contracts from 1982, Nate. Put your sharp analytical mind to work. Do not weep for me tonight. Read the pages, dry your tears, and take back exactly what belongs to us. I folded the letter with extreme care and tucked it safely inside the breast pocket of my jacket, pressing it closely against my beating heart. The crushing, suffocating despair that had kept me shivering in the freezing retail parking lot completely vanished. My mother had not abandoned me to face financial ruin. She had meticulously armed me for war. I pulled the heavy wooden chair out, sat down at the small table, and reached for the thick stack of ancient documents. I flipped open the very first page, tracing the faded blue ink signatures with my trembling index finger, completely unaware that I was about to decipher a legal trap that would shatter my father's entire existence. The overhead fluorescent bulb hummed a steady, quiet rhythm as I gently set my mother's letter aside. I reached for the thick stack of yellowed parchment. The paper felt heavy and brittle, carrying the unmistakable physical weight of history. For the first time since my world collapsed, I was not looking at these pages through the panicked and tear-filled eyes of a grieving son. I was looking at them through the highly trained lens of a senior commercial supply chain analyst. In my profession, you survive by finding the hidden loopholes in massive corporate agreements. You spend thousands of hours dissecting hundreds of pages of vendor obligations, liability transfers, and termination clauses. I knew exactly how to dismantle a contract, and my mother knew I was the only person in the family capable of reading between the lines. I spread the documents out across the cheap laminate table, flattening the curled edges with the palms of my hands. The primary document was a master commercial ground lease dated October 4th, 1982. The original signatory was my maternal great-grandfather, a quiet and unassuming man who bought vast tracts of undeveloped agricultural land decades before the city expanded. The secondary signatory was a much younger Richard Hayes. As I read the incredibly dense legal terminology, the absolute brilliance of my mother's silent strategy began to unfold before my very eyes. My father was a man completely obsessed with vertical monuments. He loved massive steel girders, towering glass facades, and enormous concrete structures bearing his bold corporate logo. He measured his worth by how high he could build and how loudly he could declare his success to the public. The documents on the table proved that Richard did indeed own every single building in his $80 million portfolio. He owned the luxury auto dealerships. He owned the sprawling suburban strip malls. He legally owned the flagship corporate headquarters where he currently sat playing the role of the tragic grieving widower. But he did not own a single ounce of the actual earth those buildings were sitting on. My mother's family owned the dirt. They always had. Richard had merely leased the ground beneath his empire under an archaic and ironclad commercial agreement formulated before I was even born. I flipped frantically to the third section of the master lease, tracing my index finger down to the specific termination conditions. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I read the faded blue text. The contract was not structured on a standard 99-year commercial timeline, like most modern real estate deals. It was explicitly structured as a lifetime estate lease completely tethered to the natural lifespan of my mother, Helen Hayes. The legal translation of that single paragraph was absolutely devastating. The exact second my father selfishly ordered the doctors to pull the plug on my mother's ventilator, the master ground lease naturally and permanently expired. Richard no longer had any legal right to occupy the territory. By killing his wife to protect his ego, he had unknowingly detonated his own financial foundation. But the true fatal blow, the absolute masterpiece of systemic karma my mother had orchestrated, was buried in subsection 4 under the reversion of property clause. I read the paragraph 3 times to ensure my exhausted brain was not completely hallucinating the words. Upon the natural termination of the lease agreement, any and all physical structures, improvements, and commercial developments erected upon the designated parcels of land shall immediately revert to the sole and exclusive ownership of the primary landowner. There was no compensation required. There was no right to appeal. There was no grace period for renegotiation. A sudden breathless gasp escaped my lips, echoing loudly in the tiny viewing room. My father had spent 40 years pouring tens of millions of dollars into developing properties on land he borrowed. He built a massive empire, assuming his sheer intimidation and bullying tactics would eventually force my mother to sign over the deeds. He assumed she was weak. He assumed she would eventually yield to his overwhelming presence. He never realized she was perfectly content letting him pay for the construction of an entire kingdom that would eventually be handed directly back to her bloodline. I frantically dug back into the manila envelope and pulled out the county tax notice. The $75,000 liability was not a random penalty. It was not a cruel joke meant to humiliate me or push me into bankruptcy. It was the legally mandated commercial property transfer tax. It was the exact financial bridge required to move the deeds from my mother's hidden trust directly into my personal name. By leaving me that specific debt, she had made me the sole and undisputed owner of the dirt. My father did not actually own an $80 million real estate empire. He owned an expired piece of paper. The very second I paid the county that transfer tax, I would officially become his landlord. Every single brick, every pane of glass, and every square foot of pavement he so proudly claimed to have built with his own 2 hands would instantly become my exclusive personal property. The freezing temperature of the credit union basement no longer bothered me. The intense hunger gnawing at my empty stomach faded completely into the background. I was holding the absolute financial destruction of Richard Hayes right in the palm of my hands. My mother had handed me the nuclear codes to our family wealth. I gathered the fragile papers, carefully sliding them back into the heavy metal lockbox. I walked out of that tiny room, leaving the weak and emotional son completely behind. The man who stepped back out into the bitter winter morning was no longer a grieving victim. I was the silent owner of an empire, and it was time to collect my rent. The euphoria of discovering the expired commercial ground lease rushed through my veins for only a few fleeting moments before the brutal reality of my current situation slammed back into me. I was sitting in a windowless concrete room beneath a forgotten rural credit union, holding a stack of incredibly powerful legal contracts, but I was still effectively homeless and completely broke. I reached across the scratched laminate table and picked up the single sheet of county paper that had caused my wife to abandon me in a freezing driveway. I stared at the bold black ink displaying the massive $75,000 liability. My mother was an absolute genius, but she was also bound by the strict and unforgiving laws of commercial inheritance. I read the detailed itemization printed beneath the terrifying total. This was not a random penalty or a forgotten back tax from a failed business venture. It was an aggregate sum composed of a municipal transfer tax, a retroactive commercial land assessment, and the mandatory execution fees required to officially and legally move the deed of the property out of her hidden trust and directly into my personal name. My mother had effectively purchased the $80 million empire for me, but she could not prepay the government to hand over the crown. The law required the designated heir to clear the municipal ledger before the title could be officially recorded and legally recognized. By transferring this specific financial burden to me, she was handing me the final key to the fortress. But that key came with a terrifying and strictly enforced ticking clock. I moved my finger down to the bottom of the county notice, reading the stark legal warning printed in heavy capitalized letters. The entire balance was due in full within 14 calendar days of the original grantor passing. My stomach plummeted directly into the floor. The air in the tiny viewing room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I frantically counted backward in my exhausted mind. Because Richard had callously pulled the plug on my mother life support in the middle of the night, the countdown had officially started the second her heart stopped beating. Exactly 7 days had already vanished while I was locked out of my house grieving in a retail parking lot and surviving on stale crackers. I had exactly 1 week left to settle the massive account. The consequences of missing that deadline were spelled out with clinical cruelty on the back of the official notice. If the transfer tax was not paid in full by the 14th day, the county would automatically seize the commercial property and place the deed up for public auction to recover the outstanding municipal debt. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as the true danger of the situation materialized in my mind. If that land went to a public county auction, Richard and his massive corporate legal team would instantly be notified by their automated monitoring software. They would flag the address, recognize it as the literal ground supporting his flagship luxury dealerships and his corporate headquarters, and Richard would simply purchase the dirt for pennies on the dollar. He would buy the land out of foreclosure, using the petty cash sitting in his business checking account. My mother-brilliant 40-year trap would be entirely dismantled before the jaws ever had a chance to snap shut. My father would secure total permanent ownership of the empire, and I would be left with absolutely nothing but a ruined credit score and the memory of my monumental failure. I shoved the heavy chair back and paced the narrow length of the concrete room. The panic was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it difficult to pull oxygen into my lungs. I had 7 days to produce $75,000 in liquid cash. Under normal circumstances, a successful supply chain analyst with a pristine financial record could simply walk into any major bank, hand over the ground lease as collateral, and secure a commercial bridge loan in a matter of hours. The sheer value of the land sitting in the middle of a highly developed commercial district practically guaranteed the approval. but my circumstances were an absolute unmitigated disaster. I was locked completely out of the traditional financial system. Claire had viciously drained every single penny of our joint life savings on her way out the door, leaving me with a balance of absolute zero. Furthermore, the county had already reported the pending tax liability to the major credit bureaus, immediately tanking my personal credit profile and causing every major lending institution to automatically restrict my access to emergency funds. My credit cards were frozen solid by automated fraud prevention algorithms. My checking account was entirely empty. I did not even possess the $20 required to fill my gas tank, and my sedan was currently sitting dead in the bank parking lot with a blown engine. I was a financial ghost. I had no residential address to put on a formal loan application. I had no usable collateral because the incredibly valuable land was not legally mine until the tax was paid. I was completely trapped in a catch-22 of catastrophic proportions. The fortune of a lifetime was sitting right on the table in front of me, but it was locked behind a heavy iron gate, and I did not have the monetary strength to lift the latch. I stopped pacing and placed both of my hands flat against the cold cinder block wall, taking deep, desperate breaths. I thought about Richard proudly giving interviews to the local press, playing the devastated widower while actively preparing to sell out my mother legacy to a national conglomerate. I thought about Trent securing his $5 million payout with a smug grin, and Claire clinking cocktail glasses in a luxury downtown steakhouse entirely funded by her shallow betrayal. They were all counting on my weakness. They were banking their entire futures on the assumption that I would simply surrender to the overwhelming pressure and disappear quietly into permanent poverty. I walked back to the table and carefully gathered the brittle parchment documents, placing them securely back inside the manila envelope, along with my mother letter. I did not have a working car. I did not have a single dollar to my name. I was completely stripped of my former life. But I possessed something far more dangerous than liquid cash. I had the absolute undeniable truth written in faded blue ink, and I had a desperate, burning rage that refused to let my mother's final, brilliant sacrifice be in vain. I was going to find that money, even if I had to walk through the fires of hell to get it. The harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the downtown public municipal library became the entire center of my universe. I claimed a secluded corner computer terminal near the dusty reference section every single morning the exact second the elderly security guard unlocked the heavy glass front doors. I was carrying a multi-million-dollar nuclear deterrent folded carefully inside the inner pocket of my thin jacket, yet my physical reality consisted of surviving on vending machine peanut butter crackers and drinking tepid tap water from a bathroom sink. I smelled like stale sweat in the freezing upholstery of my broken-down car. But the physical discomfort was entirely secondary to the relentless, terrifying ticking clock echoing in my mind. I had exactly 7 days to manifest $75,000 in liquid cash before the county auctioned off my mother's brilliant legacy. Armed with a notoriously slow, free public internet connection and a burning, undeniable sense of purpose, I started firing off commercial loan applications to every major banking institution in the state. I digitized the ancient blue ink lease agreements using a free scanning application on my cracked cell phone, meticulously compiling a bulletproof portfolio of real estate collateral. As a seasoned supply chain analyst, I knew exactly how to format a financial pitch to highlight absolute maximum yield with minimal structural risk. But the modern banking system is a cold, unfeeling algorithmic machine, and my estranged wife had successfully fed my identity straight into its grinding metal gears. Every single automated response that flooded into my email inbox was a brutal, instantaneous rejection. The algorithms did not possess the human capacity to look at the staggering underlying value of the commercial dirt I was offering. They only scanned my digital profile, saw the massive property tax lien the county had just slapped against my social security number, and verified the completely drained balance of my former joint savings account. Claire, vindictive theft had flagged me as a critical toxic liability. To the pristine corporate banking world, I was nothing more than a desperate homeless man carrying a massive government debt. I realized incredibly quickly that attempting to play by traditional polite financial rules was a guaranteed death sentence for my inheritance. I had to pivot entirely into the shadows. I dove deep into the cutthroat, unregulated underworld of private equity and hard money lending. These were the apex predators of the financial ecosystem. They did not care about pristine credit scores, marital drama, or automated risk algorithms. They only cared about absolute, undeniable leverage and exorbitant, borderline predatory returns. I sent my encrypted commercial dossier to dozens of boutique underwriting firms offering my future real estate kingdom as direct collateral for a short-term high-yield bridge loan. For 3 agonizing, silent days, I met nothing but a deafening void. The deadline loomed so close I could almost feel the county auctioneer gavel striking my neck. Then, on a freezing rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon with barely 48 hours left on the municipal clock, my cell phone vibrated against the library table. It was an unregistered local number. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Silas, a senior risk assessor for a highly aggressive independent investment firm. He did not offer polite greetings or engaging professional small talk. He simply instructed me to bring the original physical documents to an unmarked industrial park office located on the bleak industrial edge of the city. I walked into Silas' office an hour later, carrying my mother's ancient lockbox contents. The space was completely stripped down, entirely devoid of any corporate luxury or welcoming charm. It was a war room built for calculating brutal financial takeovers. Silas was a sharp, intensely calculating man with cold eyes who took my documents and read through the 1982 ground lease with the silent, focused intensity of a bomb technician dismantling an explosive device. He meticulously examined the municipal tax notice, verified the outdated county seals, and cross-referenced the exact property lines on his dual monitors. For 20 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic ticking of his desk clock and the heavy rustling of ancient parchment paper. Finally, Silas leaned back in his black leather chair. A faint, deeply predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. "This is the most beautifully ruthless legal trap I have ever witnessed in my entire career," Silas murmured, tapping his expensive metal pen directly against the lease reversion clause. "Your father is a dead man walking, and he does not even realize his legs have been entirely cut off." Silas opened his desk drawer and pushed a single freshly printed sheet of paper across the table. It was a binding term sheet for a $75,000 certified cashier check. The conditions he demanded were absolutely brutal. He required a staggering 30% interest rate and a strictly enforced 90-day repayment window. The loan was backed by a personal guarantee that would legally surrender a massive, highly profitable chunk of the commercial parcels directly to his firm if I defaulted by even a single hour. It was blatant financial extortion. It was a predatory deal explicitly designed to break desperate men and steal their assets. But I was not a desperate victim anymore. I was a man who held the undisputed ironclad title to a corporate empire. I picked up his heavy metal pen and signed my name on the dotted line without displaying a single ounce of hesitation. Within 2 hours, the funds were fully secured and transferred. I marched directly into the county clerk office, handed the glass-partitioned teller the certified cashier check, and watched with bated breath as she stamped the receipt with a heavy, satisfying thud. The municipal ledger was officially cleared. The transfer tax was paid in full. I walked out of that sterile government building with a brand-new, legally binding property deed tightly folded in my hands. The dirt beneath my father's feet, the very foundation of his entire arrogant existence, was now permanently and irrevocably mine. 3 days after the transaction at the county clerk office, the local business news channels were dominated by a single breaking headline. I watched the live broadcast playing on a small flat-screen television mounted in the corner of a cheap diner where I was eating my first hot meal in a week. The volume was low, but the imagery was loud enough to shatter glass. My father had orchestrated a massive press conference right on the front steps of the Hayes Real Estate corporate headquarters. The building was a towering monument of glass and steel that sat directly on the parcel of land I now legally owned. But Richard did not know that yet. To him and to the dozens of reporters gathered with their flashing cameras, he was the undisputed king of the mountain. Richard stood behind a sleek wooden podium flanked by a team of highly paid public relations executives. Trent stood proudly to his right, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. My father leaned into the cluster of microphones and delivered the announcement he had spent his entire life working toward. He was officially selling the entire Hayes commercial real estate portfolio to a massive national conglomerate based out of Chicago. The proposed buyout figure flashed across the bottom of the news ticker in bold green letters. $150 million. It was an astronomical sum. A generation of wealth accumulated and cashed out in a single signature. Trent grinned at the cameras, looking every bit the triumphant heir apparent, who was about to step into a life of unchecked luxury. As the camera angle widened to show the crowd of corporate guests standing behind the podium, my blood ran freezing cold. Standing right in the inner circle of the financial elite was my wife, Claire. She was wearing a brand new designer coat and holding a glass of champagne, looking absolutely radiant with opportunistic greed. Standing right beside her was her brother Brad, laughing and patting corporate executives on the back as if he had engineered the entire mega deal himself. Claire had seamlessly attached herself to Trent. She had accurately calculated the flow of the family money and positioned herself right at the source of the waterfall. She kicked me out into the snow to starve while she secured her spot on the winning team. Seeing her smiling face on that broadcast celebrating the fortune that was built on my mother's suffering made my stomach turn. But the absolute peak of their arrogance was yet to come. A reporter near the front of the press pool raised a microphone and asked Richard about the origins of his incredible empire. The reporter specifically mentioned my mother, Helen, who had passed away less than 2 weeks ago, asking if her recent death had influenced his sudden decision to sell. Richard adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked directly into the camera with a perfectly manufactured expression of solemn reflection. My father cleared his throat and delivered the most breathtaking lie I had ever heard. "I built this company from nothing with my own 2 bare hands." Richard stated, his voice booming with artificial humility. "I laid every brick, I negotiated every contract, and I sacrificed my entire youth to pull this family up by its bootstraps. Helen was a supportive wife, but this empire is my personal legacy. I am selling now because I have reached the absolute summit of what one man can achieve alone." He did not just minimize my mother. He completely erased her. He erased her family who actually provided the land. He erased the decades of silent endurance she suffered while he cheated and bullied his way through life. He took a woman who had given him everything and reduced her to a minor footnote in his grand fictional autobiography. And as if his spoken words were not enough of an insult, the broadcast director ordered a tight camera pan to the front row of the audience to capture the grieving family. The lens zoomed in directly on Tiffany. My father, 26-year-old mistress, was standing exactly where my mother should have been. She was wearing a custom black morning dress that was entirely too short, and she was smiling coyly for the press. But it was what she wore around her neck that made me grip the edge of the diner table so hard the formica threatened to crack. Resting perfectly against the collarbone of Tiffany was a heavy antique emerald pendant. It was my mother's most prized family heirloom, a piece of jewelry that had been passed down through her bloodline for 3 generations. Richard had not just moved his lover into my mother's home. He had draped her in my mother's sacred history and paraded it on live television. The old version of me, the weak emotional son that my father and my wife despised so deeply, would have broken down weeping right there in the diner. I would have felt small, insignificant, and entirely crushed by the sheer weight of their public victory. But the man sitting in that vinyl booth was a completely different entity. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the cold, calculating thrill of a hunter watching his prey walk willingly into a steel trap. Every single arrogant word Richard spoke on that broadcast, every dollar he bragged about, and every hollow victory Claire celebrated was actually pulling the noose tighter around their own necks. They were throwing a massive, lavish party on the deck of a sinking ship. They were selling a $150 million illusion built entirely on a foundation of dirt that belonged exclusively to me. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, watching my father wave to the cheering crowd on the television screen. Let them have the cameras and the applause, I thought to myself, because I have the deed. The heavy mahogany doors of Mr. Sterling Private Law Office offered a stark contrast to the grim reality of the public library where I had spent the last week. I sat across from the seasoned attorney, feeling the exhausted tension finally begin to drain from my shoulders. The certified cashier check had cleared the county system. The massive commercial property tax liability was satisfied, and the genuine deed to the land was completely secure in my personal name. Now it was time to transition from desperate survival into calculated offense. I was no longer the helpless son being thrown out into the freezing snow by a greedy wife. I was the absolute legal owner of the ground beneath my father empire, and it was time to notify my tenant that his free ride was over. Sterling pulled a fresh stack of premium paper from his desk drawer. He uncapped his fountain pen, looking at me with a rare glint of genuine predatory satisfaction. "We are not going to file a massive public lawsuit, Nathaniel," he stated calmly. "We will not call the local newspapers or engage in a loud, messy public relations war. Your father thrives on chaotic intimidation. He builds his entire strategy on wearing people down in a lengthy court battle. We are going to bypass his legal department by simply executing the basic municipal rights of a commercial landlord. We will send him a perfectly legal 30-day commercial eviction notice." I leaned forward as Sterling began drafting the formal document. The language was beautifully clinical and entirely devastating. It explicitly stated that the master ground lease signed in 1982 had permanently expired upon the death of Helen Hayes. It formally notified Richard that his holding company was currently trespassing on private property. The document demanded that the tenant completely vacate the premises within exactly 30 days, or forfeit all physical assets resting on the land to cover the staggering cost of retroactive commercial rent. It was an airtight, absolute legal death sentence. We placed the finalized notice into a thick manila envelope and paid the premium fee to send it via certified mail directly to his flagship corporate headquarters. For 2 agonizing days, I waited in total silence. I tracked the delivery status on my phone every single hour, watching the digital package make its way through the postal system. It was finally marked as delivered and signed for by the executive reception desk on a Tuesday afternoon. I knew my father. I expected him to dispatch his corporate lawyers to threaten me with endless litigation. But Richard Hayes was so utterly drunk on the impending $150 million conglomerate buyout that he chose a completely different path. He chose public theatrical arrogance. 1 hour later, my cell phone vibrated against the library table. I opened my social media feed and saw an active live broadcast streaming directly from Richard Public Corporate Profile. My father was sitting behind his massive custom-built executive desk in his corner office overlooking the city skyline. He was wearing an expensive, tailored suit, holding a glass of premium champagne. Tiffany was hovering in the background, draped in designer clothes purchased with my mother money. Trent was sitting on a leather sofa, laughing loudly at something off camera. The viewer count on the live broadcast climbed rapidly into the thousands as local real estate investors tuned in to watch the great mogul celebrate his upcoming mega deal. Then Richard reached across his desk and picked up the certified manila envelope Sterling and I had sent him. "Ladies and gentlemen," my father announced to his digital audience, a cruel, mocking smirk stretching across his face. "I want to share a little piece of entertainment with you today. As you all know, we are finalizing a historic 9-figure acquisition this month. Success always attracts parasites, but sometimes the most pathetic attempts to steal your wealth come from your own failures." He dramatically ripped the envelope open and pulled out the eviction notice. He held it up to the camera, making sure the formal legal letterhead was clearly visible to thousands of people. This piece of garbage was just mailed to me by my youngest son, Nathaniel. My father laughed, shaking his head with exaggerated pity. A son who was completely disinherited last week because he lacks the basic spine required to survive in the real world. He is currently claiming that he owns the ground beneath this very building. He is demanding that I vacate my own corporate headquarters in 30 days, or he will seize my assets. It is a desperate, pathetic scam from a bitter and broke little boy trying to extort his successful family. Trent barked with loud, aggressive laughter in the background. Tiffany leaned over and kissed my father on the cheek, whispering something clearly mocking. "This is how you handle weakness," Richard proclaimed, staring directly into the camera lens with cold, dead eyes. "You do not negotiate with beggars, you destroy them." He turned to his right and pushed the official, legally binding eviction notice straight into the teeth of a heavy-duty commercial paper shredder sitting next to his desk. The machine whined loudly as it violently chewed the document into hundreds of tiny, meaningless strips of confetti. Richard took a long, arrogant sip of his champagne, completely oblivious to the catastrophic magnitude of what he had just done. I sat in the quiet library, staring at the shredded paper falling into the plastic bin on my glowing screen. A slow, deep smile spread across my exhausted face. My father thought he was performing a brilliant display of absolute power for his adoring followers. But in the rigid, unforgiving eyes of commercial real estate law, he had just committed corporate suicide. By officially acknowledging the receipt of the document on a recorded public broadcast, and then intentionally destroying it, instead of forwarding it to his legal counsel for a formal dispute, Richard had legally waived his right to contest the eviction. The 30-day municipal clock was now officially ticking, and the great Richard Hayes had just voluntarily locked himself inside a burning building. The digital confetti of my shredded eviction notice was still raining down on my tiny phone screen when the overwhelming temptation to fight back washed over me. The old version of myself would have immediately created a fake account to argue in the comment section, or driven straight down to the corporate lobby to make a humiliating public scene. But sitting in the quiet corner of that dusty public library, I realized something fundamental about power. The loudest person in the room is always the one standing on the weakest foundation. True wealth does not scream for attention. True wealth does not need an audience to validate its existence. I turned off my phone screen and slid the device into my pocket, choosing to embrace the absolute silence of my new reality. For the next 3 weeks, I operated entirely from the shadows. I moved out of my freezing car and rented a cheap motel room on the edge of the city, using the remaining funds from my predatory bridge loan. My days were spent monitoring the public financial filings of the Hayes real estate empire. Because my father was a man deeply addicted to public validation, he broadcasted every single phase of his corporate buyout for the world to see. Selling a commercial portfolio for $150 million is not a simple transaction. It requires an army of corporate attorneys, compliance auditors, and public relations executives. To cover the staggering upfront costs of the merger, Richard did exactly what greedy men always do. He leveraged his existing assets. I watched the municipal registry update as my father secured massive high-interest bridge loans from secondary commercial lenders, who entirely failed to check the status of the underlying ground lease. He was borrowing millions of dollars in hard cash against physical buildings that were currently resting on my privately owned land. He was betting his entire financial existence on the absolute certainty that the final conglomerate payout would clear his temporary debts and leave him incredibly rich. His unchecked arrogance trickled down to every single person in his inner circle. Through the quiet lens of social media, I watched my brother Trent purchase a brand new imported sports car and sign a lease on a sprawling downtown penthouse. Trent was spending money that did not even exist yet, borrowing heavily against his promised $5 million portfolio. Claire was right there beside him, completely intoxicated by the illusion of elite wealth. She posted daily updates from high-end boutiques and exclusive country clubs showing off designer handbags and expensive jewelry. She was desperately trying to prove to the world, and perhaps to herself, that throwing me out into the winter snow was the smartest financial decision she had ever made. They were all celebrating a monumental victory before the ink on the final contract was even dry. My father hosted a lavish $1 million gala at a private rooftop venue to officially announce the impending corporate merger to his investors. The local business magazines covered the event extensively, featuring glossy photographs of Richard raising premium champagne toasts while Tiffany stood by his side, dripping in diamonds. They looked like absolute royalty, untouchable and entirely victorious. But while Richard was busy buying expensive champagne and feeding his massive ego, I was sitting in the modest office of Mr. Sterling preparing the final devastating blow. The 30-day eviction clock had officially run out. By running my legal notice through a paper shredder on a live broadcast, my father had completely forfeited his right to formally contest the eviction in a court of law. He was now officially a hostile trespasser on my commercial dirt. I sat across the polished desk from Sterling as he reviewed the final stages of our strategy. I asked him if we should send the local sheriff to lock the doors of the corporate headquarters. Sterling shook his head slowly, a sharp tactical smile forming on his face. He explained that a physical confrontation would only give Richard the public spectacle he so desperately craved. It would allow him to play the victim and possibly drag the process out through emergency legal stays. We needed a weapon that was completely silent, invisible, and utterly lethal to his upcoming real estate transaction. "We are going to file a notice of pending litigation," Sterling explained, tapping a fresh legal document on his desk. "It is formally known in the courts as a lis pendens. It is a strict legal declaration filed directly with the county clerk stating that the absolute legal ownership of the property is currently under severe dispute." I leaned forward, listening intently as the brilliant mechanics of the trap became clear. Sterling explained that the Chicago conglomerate purchasing the empire would use a massive third-party title company to verify the assets before wiring the $150 million. The title company possessed automated software that scoured public records for any liens, judgments, or encumbrances attached to the commercial parcels. We did not need to fight Richard in the lobby of his building. We just needed to drop a quiet legal landmine directly into the path of his buyers. By filing the notice of pending litigation, we would instantly place a massive toxic cloud over the entire real estate portfolio. The conglomerate would be legally barred from purchasing the buildings because Richard could not provide a clear and uncontested title to the land underneath them. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the final authorization forms. There was no grand ceremony. There was no cheering audience to witness my victory. Just the quiet scratching of ink on heavy paper in a small law office. Sterling took the documents, placed them into a secure folder, and submitted them electronically to the county records department right in front of me. The trap was officially armed and completely buried beneath the surface. My father was currently driving 100 miles an hour toward a massive financial finish line, completely unaware that the bridge ahead of him had just been quietly demolished. All I had to do now was sit back in absolute silence and wait for his entire world to drive straight off the cliff. The biting winter cold did not just chill my skin, but sank deep into my bones as I spent another miserable day researching inside the downtown public municipal library. The harsh fluorescent lights of the reading room became the entire center of my universe. I claimed a secluded computer terminal near the dusty reference section every single morning, the exact second the elderly security guard unlocked the heavy glass front doors. I was carrying a multi-million-dollar nuclear deterrent folded carefully inside the inner pocket of my thin jacket. Yet my physical reality consisted of surviving on vending machine peanut butter crackers and drinking tepid tap water from a bathroom sink. I smelled like stale sweat and the freezing upholstery of my broken-down car. But the physical discomfort was entirely secondary to the relentless, terrifying ticking clock echoing in my mind. I did not retaliate against the sickening social media videos of my father shredding my legal notices. I did not call Trent to argue or text Claire to beg for my stolen savings. I practiced the absolute discipline of silent wealth. I watched closely from the digital shadows as Richard marched blindly toward his own financial execution. He and Trent were actively finalizing the preliminary agreements to sell the entire Hayes real estate portfolio to a massive national conglomerate based out of Chicago. The proposed buyout figure was $150 million. To fund the extravagant legal fees, corporate audits, and the endless luxury celebrations leading up to the historic merger, Richard took out massive short-term bridge loans. He used his personal assets and the expected payout from the conglomerate as collateral to borrow millions of dollars in highly leveraged cash. I watched online as he threw an incredibly lavish catered party at a downtown hotel to celebrate the upcoming signing day. Claire and her smug brother Brad were visible in the background of the photos holding premium champagne flutes, having successfully anchored themselves to Trent and his promised $5 million payout. Every single dollar my father borrowed and every expensive party he hosted pushed him further out onto a fragile financial ledge that was about to completely collapse. While Richard was busy feeding his massive ego and spending phantom money, I was sitting in the modest, quiet office of Mr. Sterling preparing the final devastating legal strike. We knew that directly confronting my father with the ground lease would only give him time to initiate a messy, drawn-out public relations war. He thrived on chaotic courtroom battles where he could use his wealth to exhaust his opponents. We needed a weapon that was completely silent and visible to his arrogant eyes, and utterly lethal to his upcoming real estate transaction. Sterling explained that the Chicago conglomerate purchasing the empire would use a massive third-party title company to verify the commercial assets before wiring the $150 million. The title company possessed automated software that scoured public municipal records for any existing liens judgments or severe encumbrances attached to the targeted commercial parcels. We did not need to fight Richard in the lobby of his building. We just needed to drop a quiet legal landmine directly into the path of his highly risk-averse buyers. "We are going to file a notice of pending litigation," Sterling explained, pushing a freshly printed legal document across his desk. It is formally known in the courts as a lease pendens. It is a strict legal declaration filed directly with the county clerk stating that the absolute legal ownership of the property is currently under severe dispute. I leaned forward, listening intently as the brilliant mechanics of the trap became entirely clear. By filing this specific notice, we would instantly place a massive toxic cloud over the entire real estate portfolio. The conglomerate would be legally barred from purchasing the buildings because Richard could not provide a clear and uncontested title to the land underneath them. Furthermore, because Richard had proudly shredded the 30-day eviction notice on a live public broadcast instead of submitting it to his corporate attorneys for a formal dispute, he had effectively waived his right to immediately challenge our claim. He had voluntarily surrendered his legal shield solely for the sake of entertaining his internet followers. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the final authorization forms. There was no grand ceremony in the room. There was no cheering audience to witness my victory or applaud my resilience. There was just the quiet scratching of black ink on heavy paper. Sterling took the finalized documents, placed them into a secure file, and submitted them electronically to the county records department right in front of me. The municipal system accepted the filing and attached the warning directly to the foundational deeds of the Hayes corporate empire. The trap was officially armed and completely buried beneath the surface. My father was currently driving 100 miles an hour toward a massive financial finish line, completely unaware that the bridge ahead of him had just been quietly demolished. The Chicago lawyers would inevitably discover the pending litigation during their final automated sweep the day before the closing ceremony. They would panic and demand the original land titles, and my father would finally realize that he possessed absolutely nothing but the hollow bricks resting on my private soil. All I had to do now was sit back in absolute silence and wait for his entire arrogant world to drive straight off the cliff. The ascent to the 45th floor of the Hayes Commercial Real Estate Headquarters was entirely silent. Mr. Sterling stood to my left, holding a slim leather portfolio, while two stern-faced federal marshals stood closely behind us, exuding a quiet and absolute authority. The polished steel doors of the private executive elevator hummed smoothly as they carried us upward toward the absolute pinnacle of my father's empire. I caught my reflection in the mirrored paneling of the cab. I was not wearing a bespoke $5,000 Italian suit, and I did not have a diamond-encrusted luxury watch wrapped around my wrist. I wore a simple, expertly tailored dark gray jacket. It was the quiet armor of a man who no longer needed to broadcast his worth to the world. We stepped out onto the plush carpet of the executive reception area. The floor was completely deserted because every single person of corporate importance was currently gathered inside the main boardroom for the ceremonial signing of the $150 million buyout. We could hear the loud, arrogant echoes of celebration bleeding through the thick mahogany doors long before we even reached them. The sharp clinking of crystal champagne glasses and the booming, confident laughter of men who truly believed they had just conquered the financial universe filled the hallway. I placed my right hand flat against the cool brass handle of the boardroom door. I did not bother to knock. I simply pushed it open and walked straight into the lion's den. The scene inside the room was sickeningly opulent. A massive catered spread of caviar and expensive spirits occupied the side tables. Richard sat at the absolute head of the massive conference table, gripping a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. The lead attorneys and senior executives from the Chicago conglomerate were seated along the left flank, smiling politely. Standing directly behind my father, like a royal court of eager sycophants, were Trent Tiffany and my ex-wife Claire. They were practically vibrating with pure opportunistic greed, just waiting for Richard to sign his name and authorize the massive wire transfer. The heavy mahogany doors shut behind us with a definitive thud. The booming laughter in the room died instantly. Every single head snapped toward the entrance. My father froze completely with his gold pen hovering just a fraction of an inch above the final signature line of the master contract. The color rapidly drained from his face and his arrogant smile melted into an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. Claire let out a sharp, audible gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Tiffany nervously adjusted the stolen antique emerald pendant resting against her collarbone. Trent, however, saw an immediate opportunity to prove his loyalty to the king. He puffed out his chest and aggressively marched around the edge of the conference table, stepping directly into my path to physically block me from advancing any further into the room. "What the hell do you think you are doing here, Nathaniel?" Trent demanded, his face flushing bright red with artificial bravado. "This is a highly restricted private corporate function. You do not belong in this building, and you certainly do not belong in this room. Security is going to drag you out by your collar." He reached out with both hands, attempting to physically grab the shoulders of my tailored jacket to forcefully shove me back toward the exit. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle to defend myself because I simply did not have to. Before Trent's fingers could even graze my fabric, the two federal marshals stepped swiftly out from the shadows of the hallway and flanked me on both sides. The sudden sight of the heavy tactical gear and the gleaming silver badges pinned to their chests caused Trent to stop dead in his tracks. He stumbled backward, raising his hands in sudden panicked submission. Mr. Sterling smoothly stepped past my older brother, treating him like a minor architectural obstacle. "Gentlemen," Sterling announced, his voice projecting with a cold, clinical clarity that commanded the immediate, undivided attention of every single corporate lawyer in the room. "We are operating under the direct authority of the United States District Court. Anyone who attempts to physically impede our progress or disrupt this legal notification process will be immediately detained and formally charged with obstruction of justice." Richard stood up so fast his heavy leather executive chair toppled over backward and crashed violently onto the floor. He opened his mouth to shout an obscenity, but the words died in his dry throat as I walked calmly past him. I did not look at my father. I did not acknowledge my trembling ex-wife or the terrified mistress. I treated them exactly like the irrelevant ghosts they had already become. I walked directly to the opposite end of the long mahogany table and stopped right in front of the lead investment attorney representing the Chicago conglomerate. The executive looked up at me, his brow furrowed in deep professional confusion as he nervously adjusted his necktie. I reached out and took the slim leather portfolio from Mr. Sterling. I opened it and extracted a single crisp manila folder. Without raising my voice or showing a single trace of emotion, I slid the folder straight across the polished wood. It came to a smooth halt directly on top of the $150 million buyout contract. I strongly advise you to pause this transaction and review the contents of that folder before you authorize the transfer of any funds, I said, maintaining a completely flat and steady gaze. The lead attorney frowned, setting his pen down and opening the cover. Inside were 3 distinct pieces of paper. The very top document was the freshly stamped and certified municipal deed to the exact parcel of land sitting directly beneath our feet, legally registered exclusively in my name. The second document was the original 1982 commercial ground lease, highlighting the explicit expiration clause tied to the death of Helen Hayes. The third and final document was a certified copy of the 30-day commercial eviction notice that my father had so arrogantly shredded on a live internet broadcast. The silent trap was finally laid bare under the bright boardroom lights. The heavy silence that blanketed the massive corporate boardroom felt entirely absolute. Dozens of highly paid financial professionals held their collective breath as the lead attorney for the Chicago conglomerate carefully opened the manila folder I had just provided. I did not glare at my father. I did not offer a triumphant smirk to my trembling ex-wife or to my older brother who was currently pinned against the far wall by the sheer physical presence of the federal marshals. I simply kept my hands casually clasped in front of me, projecting the unshakable calm of a man holding a royal flush. For the benefit of everyone sitting at this magnificent table, I will make this incredibly brief, I announced. My voice was perfectly level, carrying effortlessly across the vast expanse of polished mahogany. You are all gathered here today to finalize a $150 million real estate acquisition. My father has undoubtedly presented you with extensive architectural surveys, glowing profit projections, and beautifully bound corporate ledgers proving his ownership of the physical structures. However, he conveniently omitted one absolutely critical detail. I turned my gaze directly toward the lead investment lawyer who was currently scanning the aged blue ink of the 1982 ground lease. His eyes darted rapidly back and forth across the heavy parchment paper, his professional skepticism slowly transforming into genuine alarm. Richard Hayes does not own the dirt resting beneath any of those magnificent buildings. I continued smoothly, taking a single deliberate step forward. My mother, Helen Hayes, owned the land through a private holding company. The commercial lease granting him permission to build on her property was explicitly bound to the duration of her natural life. When my father selfishly and hastily ordered her medical team to pull her life support last month, he inadvertently terminated his own master lease. For the past 4 weeks, the Hayes commercial real estate empire has been operating as an illegal trespasser on my privately owned soil. Richard let out a desperate, suffocated gasp. He gripped the edge of his massive executive chair, his knuckles turning completely stark white against the dark wood. "That is a lie," he stammered, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of the room. "I built those luxury dealerships. I built this corporate headquarters. You cannot just steal my life work with a technicality." I shifted my weight slightly, keeping my posture entirely relaxed. "I am not stealing anything from you, Richard," I replied. "I am simply enforcing the law you thought you were too important to follow." I gestured calmly toward the third document resting in the open folder. 30 days ago, my legal counsel served you with a certified commercial eviction notice. It formally demanded that you vacate the premises or face immediate asset forfeiture to cover the retroactive commercial rent you suddenly owed. Instead of forwarding that critical legal warning to your corporate defense team, you chose to run it through a paper shredder on a live internet broadcast to entertain your digital followers. You voluntarily forfeited your right to a legal appeal. Therefore, as of midnight last night, every single brick piece of glass and square foot of pavement resting on my land became my exclusive personal property as compensation for your unpaid municipal debt. You are attempting to sell a $150 million portfolio that you no longer legally possess. The lead attorney for the conglomerate abruptly stopped reading. He slid the documents over to his two senior partners. They huddled together, whispering in rapid, frantic tones while feverishly verifying the county seals, the dates, and the embedded forfeiture clauses. The tension in the room spiked to an unbearable, deeply suffocating level. Claire let out a soft, pathetic whimpering noise, backing slowly away from Trent, as if the golden child was suddenly highly radioactive. Tiffany stared at Richard with a look of pure, unadulterated horror, slowly realizing the wealthy king she had attached herself to was transforming into a penniless beggar right before her eyes. After less than 2 minutes of frantic deliberation, the lead attorney sat up perfectly straight. He looked at my father with an expression of profound professional disgust. He reached across the table, grabbed the massive master buyout contract they were about to sign, and violently ripped it exactly in half. "We are entirely done here," the attorney announced, his voice echoing like a sharp gunshot. "Mr. Hayes, you have completely misrepresented the fundamental ownership of these commercial assets. This firm does not engage in fraudulent corporate transactions, and we certainly do not purchase stolen property. You will be hearing from our litigation department shortly regarding the severe breach of contract and the financial damages we have incurred during this gross waste of our time." He snapped his thick leather briefcase shut with a loud, definitive click. His entire executive team stood up in perfect unison, adjusting their expensive silk ties and marching directly toward the heavy boardroom doors. "Wait!" Richard screamed, lunging forward over the mahogany table. His face was a tragic mask of absolute terrified desperation. "You cannot walk out on this deal. We have a verbal agreement. I have massive bridge loans to pay off. I will negotiate with him. I will give him a percentage. Just stay in the room." The executives did not even pause their confident stride. They walked straight past the stern federal marshals and disappeared down the quiet, carpeted corridor, leaving my father totally and completely abandoned. Richard collapsed back into his chair, clutching his chest as if his heart was physically giving out. The invincible titan of regional real estate was permanently gone. In his place sat a broken, foolish man who had sacrificed his devoted wife for a cheap affair and a momentary ego trip. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with a pathetic mixture of raw panic and profound, agonizing regret. He finally understood the true catastrophic cost of his own arrogance. By disrespecting my mother in her final fragile moments, he had unwittingly handed me the exact weapon required to strip him of everything he ever loved. The sound of the heavy boardroom doors clicking shut behind the Chicago executives was the absolute final nail in my father's coffin. The silence they left behind was dense and suffocating. Richard stood frozen by the mahogany table, his face devoid of all color, staring at the empty space where his $150 million salvation had just evaporated. The financial fallout did not take weeks or months to materialize. In the high-stakes world of commercial real estate, when a highly leveraged mega deal collapses, the destruction is instantaneous and absolutely brutal. The dominoes began to fall before the ink on my updated deeds had even fully dried. To understand the sheer magnitude of my father's ruin, you have to understand the toxic anatomy of a commercial bridge loan. Richard was so intoxicated by the guarantee of a 9-figure payout that he had borrowed tens of millions of dollars in short-term predatory cash to cover the massive legal fees, the public relations campaigns, and those lavish rooftop parties. Those secondary lenders did not care about his legacy. They only cared about their exorbitant interest rates. When the news of the canceled buyout leaked to the financial sector, which happened approximately 20 minutes after I walked out of that building, it triggered immediate cross-default clauses across his entire portfolio. My phone buzzed constantly as my attorney, Mr. Sterling, fed me live updates of the carnage. The private equity firms that had funded Richard's extravagant lifestyle immediately called in their debts. Because Richard did not actually own the commercial land serving as his primary collateral, the lenders instantly bypassed his useless corporate shells and went directly after his personal assets. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, every single banking institution holding my father's money froze his accounts. They initiated emergency seizure protocols on his private investments, his luxury vehicles, and the massive estate where my mother had taken her final breaths just a few weeks prior. The rapid destruction of his wealth revealed the absolute fragile hollowness of his inner circle. I received a frantic, unhinged voicemail from my father later that evening, but it was not to apologize. He was sobbing because his new life had completely disintegrated before sunset. When the first bank officials arrived at the family estate with emergency foreclosure notices, Tiffany did not stand by her man. She did not offer him comfort or vow to weather the financial storm by his side. The second Tiffany realized the credit cards were declining and the massive house was being repossessed, her artificial devotion vanished. According to the furious message my father left me, he returned to the estate to find her ransacking the master bedroom. She was ruthlessly shoving designer shoes, expensive handbags, and pure cash into the same hard-shell suitcase I had tried to throw out on the night my mother was dying. She did not even shed a single tear as she walked right past him and out the front door. The most sickening part was that she took my mother's antique emerald pendant with her, slipping away into a waiting luxury rideshare vehicle, leaving Richard entirely alone in a giant echoing house that he no longer even owned. He traded his loyal wife of 40 years for a woman who did not even stick around for 40 minutes after the money dried up. But the absolute perfection of systemic karma did not stop with my father. My older brother Trent had spent the entire morning believing he was completely immune to the blast radius. He was entirely convinced that the $5 million liquid portfolio he received from the will was perfectly safe in his private brokerage account. He spent his afternoon test-driving imported sports cars, completely oblivious to the massive trap he had willingly stepped into. Trent lacked the basic intelligence to understand the complicated corporate documents he had been signing for the last 3 years. In his desperate, pathetic rush to prove his loyalty to Richard and secure his position as the heir apparent, Trent had eagerly co-signed several of the massive corporate bridge loans as a primary executive guarantor. He wanted the prestige of being a top director, but he completely ignored the catastrophic personal liability that came with the title. When the commercial lenders realized Richard's primary collateral was legally void, they immediately pivoted to the secondary guarantor. They executed an emergency margin call directly against Trent. Because his $5 million portfolio was held at the exact same major banking institution that issued the corporate loans, the seizure was entirely automated. Trent did not even get a phone call warning him. He was standing inside an exclusive dealership attempting to put a massive down payment on a brand new luxury vehicle when his financial transaction was violently denied. The swift and brutal efficiency of the banking system was something my family had always wielded as a weapon against others. They had spent decades using aggressive financial tactics to force struggling tenants out of their strip malls and seizing properties from vulnerable business owners. They genuinely believed they were the untouchable architects of the local economy. It had simply never occurred to either my father or my brother that those exact same merciless financial algorithms could be turned directly back onto them. Watching the institutions they worshipped tear their lives apart piece by piece was the ultimate poetic justice. The banks did not negotiate. They did not offer grace periods, and they certainly did not care about the Hayes family legacy. They only cared about recovering their capital, and they stripped my family bare to get it. In a matter of seconds, the bank completely liquidated his entire $5 million trust to cover the staggering corporate defaults. Trent went from a multimillionaire ordering custom leather interiors to an unemployed broke casualty of his own blind arrogance. He had mocked me for receiving a rusted key and a mountain of debt. Yet by the time the sun went down on that fateful signing day, my rusted key had unlocked an empire, and his golden ticket had turned to absolute ash. They had built their entire identities on the foundation of my mother's suffering, and the universe had finally balanced the ledger with terrifying precision. The environment of my newly established commercial leasing office was a masterpiece of intentional understatement. I purposefully chose a modest brick building tucked away in a quiet industrial park. There were no towering glass atrium walls, no imported marble floors, and absolutely no gold-plated lettering displaying my name to the public. The space was strictly functional, designed exclusively for executing leases, managing real estate assets, and auditing corporate compliance records. It was the physical embodiment of silent wealth. I sat behind a heavy oak desk, sipping a simple cup of black coffee, reviewing the transfer deeds that had legally solidified my absolute ownership of my father's former empire. The overwhelming chaos of the past month had finally settled into a highly profitable, perfectly organized routine. I was no longer a terrified hostage to my family's financial cruelty. I was the landlord. That quiet sanctuary was abruptly violated shortly after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The solid wood door to my private office swung open without a single knock. My receptionist stood in the hallway, looking entirely apologetic, but she was easily shoved aside by the frantic arrival of my wife. Claire stumbled into the room, gasping for air as if she had just sprinted a marathon. The pristine, arrogant glow she had so proudly displayed at the conglomerate signing ceremony was completely gone. Her designer coat looked wrinkled and unkempt. Her expensive makeup was visibly smeared around the edges of her panicked eyes. She looked absolutely frantic, desperately searching the room until her gaze locked on to me, sitting calmly behind the desk. "Nathaniel," she cried out, her voice trembling with an Oscar-worthy performance of profound relief. "Oh my God, I have been looking everywhere for you. I have been so incredibly worried about you." She practically threw herself into the guest chair opposite my desk, burying her face in her hands and forcing out a series of loud, dramatic sobs. It took every ounce of my professional self-control not to laugh out loud at the sheer transparency of her sudden devotion. Just a few weeks ago, she had eagerly drained my entire life savings, thrown me out into the freezing winter snow, and laughed on speakerphone while her brother called me a pathetic loser. Now, smelling the unmistakable scent of a multi-million-dollar victory, she was desperately attempting to rewrite our history. I was so completely terrified, Nate Claire continued, wiping away a solitary, perfectly timed tear. Richard and Trent were so aggressively intimidating. They deliberately made me believe you were going to drag us both into an inescapable federal bankruptcy. My brother Brad completely poisoned my mind. Brad told me those horrible, manipulative lies, and he actively forced me to empty our joint accounts just to protect my own basic survival. You have to understand the massive, overwhelming pressure I was operating under. The entire family was turning against us. But deep down inside my heart, even when I was walking away, I always knew you were a brilliant genius. I knew you were going to somehow outsmart them all and take your rightful place at the absolute top of the company. We can finally build the beautiful, luxurious life we always dreamed about together. Just please tell me you can forgive me for being so momentarily blind." The old version of myself might have engaged in a bitter shouting match. I might have screamed about the absolute agony of sleeping in my freezing car while she drank expensive champagne on a luxury rooftop. But the man sitting behind that oak desk no longer operated on desperate emotion. I simply sat there and watched her exhaust her fabricated script. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not offer her a tissue to dry her eyes. I evaluated her the exact same way I would evaluate a highly toxic, severely depreciated corporate liability. When she finally stopped crying and waited eagerly for my absolution, I reached into my top desk drawer and pulled out a pristine white envelope. I placed the envelope onto the polished wood and slid it smoothly across the surface. It came to a stop directly in front of her trembling hands. Claire looked down at the document, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking through her manufactured grief. She slowly reached out, opened the flap, and pulled out a heavy stack of legally certified papers. It was a finalized, highly expedited divorce decree fully signed and approved by a district family court judge. I watched her eyes dart wildly across the bold legal headers and the detailed asset division clauses. The fake tears evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, sudden realization of her absolute failure. "You made an incredibly critical strategic error when you rushed to abandon me, Claire," I stated with a calm, even tone, watching the color rapidly drain from her cheeks. "By intentionally draining our joint banking accounts and formally vacating our marital residence the very same night you violently kicked me out into the snow, you legally established a definitive and undeniable date of permanent separation. You severed our financial partnership to protect yourself from my $75,000 tax debt. You cannot retroactively claim the rewards of a battle you actively refuse to fight. More importantly, the commercial land trust I inherited from my mother was executed entirely outside the legal boundaries of our marriage. Furthermore, the immense wealth I hold today was generated through penalty forfeiture on an external commercial ground lease entirely separated from any shared marital funds. My legal team audited and verified every single specific detail. You have zero community property claims to this empire. You get absolutely nothing." Claire dropped the divorce decree onto the desk as if the paper was physically burning her skin. Her face twisted into a vicious, unrecognizable mask of pure hatred. "You cannot do this to me," she shrieked, slamming her palms down hard against the oak surface. "I gave you 5 years of my prime. I am your wife. I deserve a permanent stake in this company, and I will drag you through the courts for a decade to get my money." I simply reached over and pressed a small intercom button on my telephone. Less than 5 seconds later, my private security director stepped quietly into the office. "Please escort my former spouse off the commercial property," I instructed, leaning back in my leather chair, "and permanently revoke her visitor access credentials." As the guard firmly guided a screaming, furious Claire out the door, her frantic threats echoing down the long corridor, I finally breathed in the incredibly clean, completely silent air of my newly liberated life. 6 months passed since the day the boardroom doors closed on my father and his crumbling empire. The transition of power was not a loud or chaotic spectacle. It was a methodical and clinical transfer of assets, executed perfectly through the county courts. I did not move into the massive corner office overlooking the city skyline that Richard had occupied. I found that space to be entirely suffocating and infected with decades of his toxic ego. Instead, I converted a quiet, spacious conference room on the 2nd floor into a functional, understated workspace. I absorbed the entire network of luxury auto dealerships and commercial strip malls directly into my own private holding company. When the local business community heard about the hostile takeover, they naturally assumed I would liquidate the entire portfolio for a massive, quick payout. They thought I would act exactly like a ruthless corporate raider and fire the hundreds of innocent employees who relied on those businesses to feed their families and pay their mortgages. But I am not my father. I am a supply chain analyst. I understand that the true lasting value of any commercial enterprise is not the expensive glass and steel it is built from, but the hardworking people who keep the operations running smoothly every single day. I kept every single employee on the payroll, from the regional sales managers down to the janitorial staff. I spent the first 90 days rigorously auditing the corporate ledgers and stripping away the massive layers of financial rot my father had accumulated. I systematically eliminated his bloated executive expense accounts, his private country club memberships, and the absurd luxury vehicle allowances he handed out to his cronies. I took all of that recovered capital and reinvested it directly back into the workforce. We raised salaries across the board, improved health benefits, and established a transparent, ethical standard of business that actually respected our commercial tenants instead of exploiting them. By simply removing my father and his monumental greed from the equation, the holding company became more profitable in a single quarter than it had been in the last 5 years combined. I built a sustainable, honest empire that finally honored my mother and her quiet resilience. While the newly restructured company thrived, the men who had tried to destroy me faced a reality they were entirely unequipped to handle. My older brother Trent was completely exiled from the prestigious corporate world. His professional reputation was permanently stained by the massive loan defaults, and his lack of any actual marketable skills became painfully obvious to every recruiter in the state. The golden child who once bragged endlessly about his $5 million trust fund and drove imported sports cars was now working as a mid-level shift supervisor at a massive suburban home improvement store. He spent his exhausting days wearing a cheap polyester retail vest and managing inventory schedules in the plumbing aisle for slightly more than minimum wage. Richard suffered a fate far worse than mere employment humiliation. The total collapse of his financial standing forced him into a brutal and highly publicized personal bankruptcy court. The banking institution stripped him of every luxury he ever claimed to own. He was currently renting a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a rundown residential neighborhood on the dreary outer edge of the city. He had no expensive mistresses, no corporate sycophants, and absolutely no structural power left to wield over anyone in his life. He was a king without a castle, and a bully without a victim. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the final lingering piece of the past attempted to crawl back into my reality. I was sitting comfortably at my desk reviewing a highly promising quarterly earnings report when my office telephone chimed softly. My executive assistant informed me that an older man was holding online, one deeply insisting that it was an absolute family emergency requiring my immediate attention. I reached out slowly and pressed the blinking illuminated button, picking up the receiver. Nathaniel, a weak, trembling voice pleaded through the speaker. It took my brain a moment to even recognize the sound. It was Richard. The booming, terrifying cadence of the great commercial real estate titan was completely gone. It was replaced entirely by the pathetic hollow rasp of a broken and desperate old man begging for scraps. I remained entirely silent, waiting for him to speak his piece. "Please, Nate." My father begged, his voice cracking under the heavy weight of his own complete humiliation. "I have absolutely nothing left. The bankruptcy lawyers took my retirement accounts and my savings. The landlord at this terrible apartment complex is threatening to evict me next week because I cannot even cover the basic utility bills and the monthly rent. I know we have had our serious differences in the past, but I am still your father. You have to help me. I know you are running the commercial dealerships now. You can give me a management position somewhere. You can create a remote consulting role for me. I will take any small salary you offer me. I just need one single chance to get back on my feet." I listened to the sound of his shallow, desperate breathing over the telephone line. I vividly remembered the freezing winter night I stood in the dark hallway of my childhood home, begging this exact same man for basic human decency. I remembered the incredibly cold and vicious look in his dark eyes when he told me he would sign a document to pull the plug on my dying mother just to protect his own selfish pride. I did not feel a single ounce of anger toward him anymore. I just felt a profound and quiet emptiness where a father should have been. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished oak surface of my desk. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the exact same chilling absolute authority he had used against me when I was completely powerless. "You have the medical power of attorney over your own life now, Richard," I said calmly, deliberately echoing the darkest night of my entire existence. "Fix it yourself, Hicks." I placed the telephone receiver back onto the base with a soft, definitive click, disconnecting the call and severing my ties to that man for the rest of my natural life. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns of the Memorial Park. It was a crisp and entirely peaceful autumn day, a world away from the bitter, freezing winter night when my entire existence had been violently ripped apart. I stood quietly near the crest of a gentle green hill, looking down at a beautiful, solid block of polished black granite. My mother name was carved deeply into the dark stone with absolute elegant precision. It was not a flashy monument, and it did not bear any boastful corporate titles. It was simply a dignified, enduring tribute to a remarkably brilliant woman. I had personally paid for the installation using the direct profits from her own commercial land trust. I ran my fingers over the cold engraved letters, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over my chest. Richard had desperately wanted to use her funeral as a cheap public relations stunt to bolster his fading, fragile ego. He had wanted to erase her true legacy and replace it with a shallow narrative where he played the conquering hero. Instead, she had orchestrated a masterpiece of legal warfare from her hospital bed, ensuring that her actual legacy would physically outlast his artificial empire. I whispered a quiet thank you to the empty air, knowing she had sacrificed her own peace to hand me the ultimate weapon of survival. I slipped my hands into the pockets of my tailored jacket and took a slow, deep breath of the sharp autumn air. The incredible contrast between my current reality and the absolute bottom of the abyss was almost too massive to fully comprehend. Just 6 short months ago, I was a completely broken man. I vividly recalled the agonizing physical pain of sleeping contorted in the back seat of my dead sedan in that desolate retail parking lot. I remembered the fierce, hollow gnawing in my empty stomach and the terrifying realization that my own wife had stolen every single dollar to my name. They had aggressively pushed me out into the freezing darkness, expecting me to simply freeze to death or crawl back to them begging for scraps of mercy. They had weaponized my grief and weaponized the legal system, assuming I possessed no capacity to fight back. Yet the very elements they used to orchestrate my destruction became the exact blueprints for my absolute victory. The journey from a freezing car to the absolute head of a corporate holding company taught me a fundamental truth about human nature. Betrayal is incredibly loud, but justice is beautifully quiet. While Richard threw million-dollar parties and Trent leased sports cars on phantom credit, I sat in a dusty public library reading the fine print. I did not rely on emotion or anger to rebuild my life. I relied on the cold, calculating mechanisms of property law and the undeniable power of an ironclad contract. Looking back at the catastrophic downfall of the people who tried to ruin me, I finally understand the greatest lesson my mother ever taught me. I want you to listen to me very carefully right now, because this is the exact truth that separates the temporary winners from the permanent architects of wealth. The loudest people in the room are always standing on the weakest foundations. They build their towering, glittering empires entirely on fragile egos and temporary validation, completely ignoring the crucial fine print of basic human respect, loyalty, and truth. They convince themselves that screaming the loudest and wearing the most expensive clothes somehow makes them invincible. But an empire built on borrowed dirt is destined to inevitably collapse the moment the actual owner comes to collect the rent. They spend their entire lives constructing a magnificent illusion while completely forgetting to secure the bedrock underneath it. When the people you trust decide to push you out into the bitter cold, do not waste your breath screaming. Do not lower yourself to their level of chaotic public theatrics, and do not ever beg them for a seat at their toxic table. Take that rejection and let it sharpen your mind into a lethal instrument. Step back into the shadows and read the fine print. Let them celebrate their premature victories and let them drown in their own unchecked leverage. You must learn to play the long game. True wealth is completely silent. It does not need to boast or brag because it is legally anchored to the earth. The power of the silent win is the most devastating force you can ever wield against a manipulative person. I took my hand away from the cool granite of the headstone and turned my back to the setting sun, ready to return to the quiet, understated office, where I now managed the commercial territory my family tried to steal. I no longer carry the heavy, toxic burden of proving my worth to people who never possessed the capacity to understand my actual value. My balance sheet speaks for itself, and the quiet peace in my heart is something Richard will never be able to purchase. If you have ever been severely underestimated by the exact people who were supposed to love and protect you, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who desperately needs to hear it today. I want you to leave a comment below about a specific time in your own life when you stepped back. Let the arrogant people dig their own graves and let your ultimate success make all the noise. Do not ever let anyone convince you that your quiet nature is a weakness. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about the undeniable power of the silent win. Remember to always secure your foundation. Read the hidden clauses and never forget who truly owns the ground beneath your feet.